All right, so I'm back inside our app.css file of the Quill homepage. I'm going to scroll down to our button components. And for our hover and active states for each button type, I'm just going to come and add the transform property, grab the value scale, and I'm just going to scale it by a very small amount of 1.05, which would be 5% in the X direction, and then 1.05 for 5% in the Y direction. I'm going to copy this and just add it to the hover and active state for each different type of button. So for our outline button, and for our secondary button. Okay, I'll refresh and let's go see this effect. I'm going to hover over Get Started, and you can see it just pops a little bit more. It's a very subtle visual effect that just makes the element a bit more interesting. There's our primary button, there's our primary outline button, and for the secondary button, you can see that little pop just makes the homepage seem a little bit more dynamic. So now let's go handle the beta in the top right corner. The first thing I'm going to do is head over to index.html. I'm going to locate the logo, which is over here. We have an image self-closing tag wrapped in an anchor tag. Now to achieve this, I'm actually going to go use a pseudo element. We covered this much earlier on in the course, where we saw we could use pseudo elements to inject decorative elements onto our page without actually adding the content in the HTML markup. I want to do it this way because I don't really want beta to be inside the HTML markup. It's a little bit more of a decorative element that's being added to the page. So what I'm going to do is come add a class onto this anchor tag and set its value to beta. I'm going to head to app.css. I'm going to scroll down to the bottom of our components, as this is a piece of UI that we may want to reuse elsewhere. The first thing I'm going to do is select the beta class, and I'm just going to give this a position of relative. The aim of this is just to create our anchor point for our pseudo element. So effectively, all I've done is I'm saying that this anchor tag should now be our anchor point for when we come and position our pseudo element. So let's go do our pseudo element now. I'm going to select beta. For pseudo elements, we add 2 colons, and I'm going to do this after. I want this decorative element injected after our anchor tag. So the first thing I'm going to do is grab the content property. We saw this earlier in the course where we can add some text like the word beta. I'm now going to use the position property and set its value to absolute. So I'll refresh, and you can see straight away we have our beta icon being injected after the anchor tag. And now we're going to go use offset properties to better position the beta. Now, if you remember, for absolute positioned elements, its reference point is the closest non-static ancestor. And that is why I added position relative onto the beta class. I did that because our pseudo element over here now has a reference point of the anchor tag itself. So if I open up DevTools and inspect the anchor tag over here, the edges of this blue box is now the reference point for the beta text. So I want to initially get it in the top right corner. So I'm going to add an offset property of top with a value 0, and the offset property of right with the value 0. I'll refresh, and this now moves our beta into the top right corner of our Quill logo. Now again, this might seem a bit confusing, so let me just go through it one more time. Our beta pseudo element, which is the content beta, is absolutely positioned, and its reference point is the logo itself. That's because we added a class onto our anchor tag, which is wrapping the image, beta. So the edges of the blue box that you see here is the reference point for our pseudo element. So setting a top of 0 moves our element 0 away from the top of the logo, and a right of 0 moves it 0 away from the right of the logo. And once again, this is all being achieved because for absolute positioned elements, like our pseudo element over here, its reference point is its closest non-static ancestor, which for us is just the anchor tag itself. So that's why it's really important we added position relative onto this class over here so that it could act as the reference point for our pseudo element. Now, before we go and use the transform function, I just want to improve the style of this. Let's give the beta a font size of 1.2 rem. I'm going to give it a background color of our tertiary base, so that orange color. Let's give it some padding of 0.5 rem and 1 rem. And I'm going to give it a border radius of 4 pixels. All right, I'm just going to refresh this. All right, this is looking a lot better. The last thing I want to go do is just change the font color to our white. I'll refresh, and this is looking good. So now all we want to do is move the beta icon a bit more up and a bit more to the right. So to do that, we're going to use the transform property. We're going to grab the translate function. To move it to the right, we need to use a positive value. I'm going to initially try 50%, and to move it up, we need to use a negative value. So I'm going to use a negative value of 50%. Now, you could use pixels here. I just want to use percentages. And if you recall, for this first value is the width of the parent, and for the second value is the height of the parent. The parent is the logo itself. So let's refresh this. And this is looking good, but I actually want it a little bit more up and to the right, as this is just blocking too much of the text. So I'm going to come and change this value to 70% and minus 70% here. I'll refresh, and for me this looks great. It's moved to the top right and isn't covering the text of the logo. Okay, so once again, I just wanted to demonstrate the use of the transform function. We've added a nice scale effect onto our buttons, and we've added in this decorative beta element. As I've mentioned, I'm actually happy with the page how it looked before, but I did just want to demonstrate this so you could see the transform property in action. And don't worry too much about the pseudo element. This may seem a bit advanced because pseudo elements are always confusing, but just remember, a pseudo element is just injecting some content after the page renders, and we're just absolutely positioning this pseudo element, where its reference point is the logo itself. Well done, positioning is complete. You now have the skills to control the precise placement of elements on your web page, giving you full flexibility in your designs. Next up, we'll dive into how we can enhance our web page design with shadows and transitions. We'll kick off by learning how to add depth and dimension to elements on your page using shadows. We'll be discussing how shadows work, the shadow property, shadow design guidance, and flat design versus shadows. So let's first talk about how shadows actually work. I'm going to be explaining it using this table and carpet setup. I'm going to place a torch above the table so that it's positioned right in the center of the table. This would result in a shadow being cast directly under the table. If we were to look at the table from top down, all we would see is the top of the purple table. And I'm just going to mark the current position of the torch. Now, moving light in the same plane as the table moves the shadow horizontally and vertically on the floor. So I'm going to move our torch to the bottom right of the table. And looking top down, it would appear as if our shadow has moved up and to the left. In CSS terms, we would call this the X offset horizontally and the Y offset vertically. So that's the first thing we can do. We can move the position of the torch, which would result in the shadow moving in the X direction and in the Y direction. Let's look at the second thing we can do. Moving light up and down creates a blur, resulting in edges that appear soft or sharp. So what I'm going to do is move the torch up, and this would result in the edges of our shadow blurring like this. So as we move our torch up and down, the edges of our shadow will become soft or sharp. And in CSS terms, we call this the blur radius. Now for the last factor, the size of the table impacts the size of the shadow. So if we increase the size of the table, this in turn would cast a larger shadow. And in CSS terms, we call this the spread radius. So let's now take a look at the shadow property. In CSS, it looks like this, where the property name is box-shadow, and we have 5 different values. I'm going to be talking about them in reference to the table we just looked at. The first value, 10 pixels, represents the X offset, and this moves our shadow horizontally, where a positive value like 10 pixels will move it to the right, and a negative value would move it to the left. The second value, minus 20 pixels, represents our Y offset. This moves our shadow vertically, where a negative value like minus 20 pixels moves our shadow up, and a positive value would move it down. The next value, 5 pixels, represents the blur radius, which softens the edges of the shadow like this. The next value, 30 pixels, represents the spread radius, which will enlarge the size of the shadow, as if the element was larger in size, just like we increased the size of the table. Now the last value is color, so we can actually change the color of our shadow to something like a blue. Now the X offset and Y offset values are always required. We have to provide those for box shadow to work. The other 3 values, blur radius, spread radius, and color, are all optional. So let's go play around with this inside VS Code. Alright, so I've gone ahead and created an index.html file and linked a style sheet which is currently empty. In our HTML, I'm just going to go add a div and give it the class container. In app.css, I'm going to select the container. I'm going to give it a width of 400 pixels, a height of 400 pixels, a background color of gray, and just to move the container away from the top left of the browser, I'm going to give it some margin top of 200 pixels and margin left of 200 pixels. All right, let's check it out in the browser. Okay, so here's our gray box. Now let's go play around with the box shadow property. I'll go grab box shadow. And as I mentioned, we have to provide an X and Y offset value. I'm first just going to set these both to 0 pixels. I'll refresh, and at the moment, the shadow is directly under the box, just like we saw with the table example when the light was shining directly into the center of the table. Let's first add 50 pixels for the X offset. I'll refresh, and you'll see the shadow moves to the right by 50 pixels. I'll add 50 pixels for the Y offset, and you'll see the shadow moves down 50 pixels. And as I mentioned, we can also make these negative values, so it moves in the opposite direction, in this case, left and up. Okay, I'm just going to change them back to positive values, and let's now take a look at the next value. The next value is the blur radius, which just has a default value of 0 pixels. So I'll refresh, and you'll see there's no change. Let's now change this to a value like 10 pixels. I'll refresh, and you can see the edges of the shadow are beginning to blur. Let's increase this to 20 pixels, and you'll see it blurs even more. So a higher blur radius value will result in the edges of our shadow being softer. The next value was the spread radius. The default value is 0, so if I refresh, you'll see there's no change. Let's change this to a value like 30 pixels. I'll refresh, and you can see the shadow has now increased in size. Now, one thing I do want to discuss at this point is that if you just wanted to add a spread radius and no blur radius onto your shadow, you'd explicitly have to give your blur radius a value of 0 pixels. I'll refresh, and the reason you have to do this is because the third place value will always be the blur radius, and the fourth place value will always be the spread radius. So if I just did this and refreshed, the browser's interpreting this as a 30 pixel blur radius, not spread radius. So to ensure we get a 30 pixel spread radius, we have to explicitly give the third slot for the blur radius a 0 pixel value, so that our value of 30 pixels is now in the fourth slot, which is for the spread radius. All right, I'm just going to change this back to 10 pixels. And the final thing we can do is change the color of our shadow. I'm just going to make this blue. I'll refresh, and you'll now see our shadow is blue. So let's now take a look at some shadow guidance. Shadows can be used to add depth and dimension to a design to create separation between UI elements. Looking at this web page here, this UI element in the center of the page, listing the main use cases of this web application, has a shadow to create a separation between it and other elements on the page. Another common example of this is on cards, where they have shadows to add depth and dimension in order to separate them and create contained units. The next piece of guidance is that shadows should be light, as darker shadows can create a harsh and unnatural appearance in the design. Looking at this web page over here, the shadows should be light and not too dark. You can see the light shadows on each of these cards is subtle and helps contain the content, where a dark shadow would just look a bit too overpowering. Let's now talk about the sizes of shadows. Smaller shadows are ideal for enhancing smaller components like buttons and cards, which add subtle depth. Looking at this page over here, this card has a small shadow which helps create a subtle depth. Medium-sized shadows can be used for larger components, helping them stand out. Looking at this web page over here, this main image has a medium-sized shadow, helping it pop a bit more. Large shadows are used when an element should appear to be floating above the rest of the design. A good example of this is on a drop-down for a navigation bar, where a large shadow is used, which gives it the appearance as if it's floating above the rest of the page. Now, the last thing to discuss is flat design versus shadows. Flat design uses borders and background colors to achieve separation instead of shadows. Looking at an example of this, on this web page, we have a border on our navigation bar, as well as borders on all of our cards. The borders contain related content and create separation between different content. You can see no shadows are used on this page. Another example is this web page here, where both these cards are using background color to contain their content and create separation. Now, me personally, I'm a big sucker for flat design. I don't personally like using shadows, as I love simple, flat design. However, if you do plan on using shadows, shadows should not be used too often, as overuse can make a design look cluttered and overwhelming. This web page is a good example of how to use shadows. You can see these testimonial cards have shadows which make them pop, but below we have a card which is just using background color. So shadows are being used throughout this design to help elements pop, but are not being used too much. So let's wrap up this chapter by starting to build our next summary card, shadows and transitions. In this chapter, we looked at shadows. which we saw were used to add depth and dimension to elements. The CSS property looked like this, box-shadow, and looking at this in diagram form, we looked at a table on a carpet. The first value, 10 pixels, is the X offset. The second value, minus 20 pixels, is the Y offset, and this will move our shadow in the same plane as the table. In this case, 10 pixels to the right and 20 pixels high. The next value is the blur radius, which will blur the edges of the shadow like we see here. The next value of 30 pixels was the spread radius, which increases the overall size of the shadow like we see here. And the final value was the color, which changes the color of the shadow, like we see in the diagram here. Now the X offset and Y offset are required, whereas the blur radius, spread radius, and color are all optional. Alright, so I'm back inside our Quill project. As I've mentioned a few times by now, I'm already happy with how the design looks, and I'm personally a big fan of flat design, so I generally don't like adding shadows. But for the purpose of implementing the shadow property we just looked at, I am going to go add some shadows. I'm going to add shadows to the hover state of our buttons. When I hover over our buttons, I'd like a small shadow to appear beneath them. Now I'm actually going to go handle the secondary button first, because that has a blue background. And the color of the shadow needs to work on this button when there's a colored background, as well as our primary and outline buttons, which just have a white background. So I'm going to scroll down to the button secondary, hover, and active state. I'm going to add our box shadow property. Now I just played with these values earlier to make them look good. So usually you'd go through a bit of an iterative process to find values you're happy with. I'm going to set an X offset of 0. I only want the shadow to appear below the button and not move left or right. I'm then going to use a 3 pixel Y offset value so that it moves down by 3 pixels. I'm then going to set a blur radius of 6 pixels, and I'm going to set a spread radius of 0 pixels, as I don't want the shadow to get any larger. For the color, I'm going to use our gray base color. I'll refresh, and you'll see when I hover over the button, we get a very subtle shadow appearing below it. Now just to note, for the spread radius, I don't actually have to include that, so I could remove it, because the browser is smart enough to know that this value is to do with color and not spread radius, so it just ignores the value over there. So I'll refresh, and you'll see there is no change. Now I know I mentioned in the guidance, we generally want our shadows to be lighter, but the problem is, if I use the gray tint value, you'll just see how funny this looks. It's just a bit too overwhelming when we have a gray tint on the blue background. So I'm just going to change this back to the base color. So I'm now going to copy this declaration, and I'm going to add it to our primary outline, hover, and active state, as well as our primary hover and active state. I'll refresh, and you'll see when I hover over these buttons, we get that same shadow appearing below. Now in a perfect world, I probably want these to be a bit lighter, but we are being a little bit forced to make it darker because of this case down here. But it still does look fine, and makes these buttons pop quite nicely when you hover over them. Next up, we'll explore how to create smooth, animated style changes with transitions. We'll be discussing what are transitions, timing functions, and transitions design guidance. So before we start discussing transitions, I want to discuss how things work when we don't have transitions. When an element moves between states, the changes occur immediately. We're talking about between states here, so we're thinking about pseudo-classes. As an example of this, if we have a button and our cursor, and on the button, we have a pseudo-class for the hover state to make it change color, this is what would happen. As soon as our cursor hovers over the button, it changes color immediately. Let's go play around with this inside VS Code. Alright, so I've gone ahead and created a new index.html file and linked to style sheet, which is currently empty. In our body, I'm just going to add a single div, and I'm going to give it the class card. In app.css, I'm going to select card. I'm going to give it a width of 500 pixels, a height of 500 pixels, and a background color of light blue. I then want to select the hover state of this card using a pseudo class, and I'm going to change its background color to light coral and its border radius to 50%, so that when we hover over our card, the background color will change, and it will change from a square to a circle. So let's check this out in the browser. So you can see, initially, we have our light blue square, and watch what happens when I hover over it. It instantly changes to a light coral circle. The main point I want you to take away is that the change in state is instant. So transitions are used to create a smooth, gradual change to an element's properties when it undergoes a state change. So looking back at the example before, if we now hover over our button, you'll see it gradually changes to purple and is not instant. This user experience is just smoother and doesn't feel so jarring. So let's take a look at the transition property in CSS. It looks like this, where transition is the property, and there are three possible values. The first value, in this case background color, is the property we are wanting to undergo a transition. The next value is the duration of the transition, measured in seconds, in this case 0.5 seconds. And the last value is the timing function. This is the rate at which we want the transition to occur. We're going to be looking at the timing function in more detail soon, but it is responsible for how we use our 0.5 seconds. Do we want the transitioning happening really fast to start and then slowing down, or really slow to start and then speeding up? Now, some important notes. The transition property is defined on the initial state. So not on the pseudoclass, but the initial state. Now, the next note is that for the property you specify, it defaults to all properties that are changing if not defined. So we don't actually have to provide a property that's undergoing the change. We can leave this blank. And what this means is that any properties that are changing between the initial state and what's in the pseudo class will automatically all go through the transition. The duration is required, and for the timing function, it defaults to ease properties if not defined. Ease is just one of the timing functions, so if we don't specify a timing function, it will just be ease. And we will explore timing functions in a bit more detail soon. So let's go play around with this inside VS Code. So picking up where we left off, let's go add a transition onto our cards so that the properties that are changing, the background color and border radius, doesn't happen instantly. As I mentioned, we add the transition property on the initial state, in this case the card, and I'm just going to put the single value that is actually required, which is the time. I'm going to make it 2 seconds. I'll save and refresh and watch what happens when I hover over the card now. Over a 2-second time period, the card is nicely transitioning from a blue square to a coral circle. Now, because I haven't specified the properties I want to change, the transition will automatically change any properties from the initial state to the hover state. In this case, the background color is changing between the two. And although the border radius isn't explicitly defined on the card, the border radius on the card is 0. And the border radius here is 50%. So that is changing from 0 to 50%. Something like width and height is not changing between the card and hover state. So that isn't being picked up by the transition. The transition is only picking up properties that are actually changing. Just to explore this a bit more, if I come and add a border on our initial state of 5 pixels solid and black, I'll refresh, you can see the border is there, and when I hover, our 5 pixel border is not changing. If I wanted it to change, I would need to add a border property onto our hover state. Let's make it something like 20 pixels dashed and green. And now because our border is changing between states, that will be picked up in the transition. So I'll refresh, and you'll see the border changes to our dashed green. Now let's check out the case when I only want a specific property to change. For example, let's just change the background color. So to do that, the first value would be background color, and we keep the 2-second duration. I'll refresh, and you'll now see only the background color undergoes the transition, whereas the border radius and border will instantly change. Let's check that out. So you'll see we went immediately from a square to a circle, and a black border to a green border, whereas the background color does take time to transition, because that is the only property we're specifying to undergo a transition. If I wanted to specify another property, we would comma separate this, and for example, let's do border radius, and set its value to say 3 seconds. I'll refresh, and you'll now see the border radius and background color undergo a transition, whereas the border will instantly change. So let's check this out. You'll see the green border instantly changed, whereas the background color and border radius underwent transitions. Now, in most cases, it's fairly simple, and we do just want all our properties on the hover state to change. So a lot of times, the property value will be blank. So let's now take a deeper dive into timing functions. Timing functions controls the speed of the animation. I'm going to be going through some of the more common timing functions. The first one is ease. This starts slowly, speeds up, and then slows down. Now for each of these, I've got a small visualization. This green ball starts slowly, speeds up in the middle, and then slows down. The next timing function is linear, and this is a consistent speed start to end. Looking at this visualization, the green ball is just remaining at a constant speed. The next timing function is ease in. This starts slowly and accelerates to the end. In our visualization, you'll see our green ball starts off slowly, but then accelerates towards the end. The next timing function is ease out. This starts quickly and slows down towards the end. It's the opposite of ease in. In our green ball visualization, you'll see it starts very quickly and then slows down towards the end. The final timing function we're going to look at is ease in out. This starts slowly, speeds up in the middle, and slows down at the end. In our green ball visualization, you'll see it starts slowly, speeds up towards the middle, and then slows down. Now, if you don't specify a timing function on your transition, it just defaults to ease. And in all honesty, I wouldn't worry too much about these. The timing functions are there to provide precise control of how you want your transitions to play out. But I wouldn't stress about them too much, and in most cases, I would just use the default ease state, which means that you don't even need to specify a timing function. But let's go play around with these inside VS Code. Alright, so I've gone ahead and prepared this file ahead of time. In our HTML, I have repeated units like this. I have a paragraph denoting the timing function name, for the first one ease, and then I just have a div where I've given it the class of the same name. These units are repeated for each timing function, so linear, ease in, ease out, and ease in out. In our CSS file, each of the divs are styled the same. The only difference between them is the timing function. You'll see each div has the same width and height, the same background color, and the same margin bottom just to create space. These four properties are repeated on every single div. The hover states are also the same. The only thing I'm changing is the border radius for each div. So ease hover has a border radius of 50%. And linear hover also has a border radius of 50%. The only difference between each of these divs is the timing function on our transition property. So for ease, the transition property is ease. For linear, the transition property is linear. For ease in, it's ease in. For ease out, it's ease out. And for ease in out, it's ease in out. So let's go through these one by one. I'm going to hover over ease, and this is the default value, which starts slowly, speeds up, and then slows down. For linear, the transition happens at a consistent speed. For ease in, it starts slowly and accelerates to the end. So you'll see there it got a lot faster towards the end of the transition. For ease out, it's the opposite. It starts quickly and then slows down. And for ease in out, it starts slowly, speeds up in the middle, and then slows down at the end. Now, just to note, ease and ease in and out may seem the same. They're both starting and ending slowly and speeding up in the middle. So there's ease, and there's ease in out. Now, the difference has to do with the acceleration in the middle. And you can see how these timing functions can just be a bit overkill. And just to show you how far it can go, there's some incredibly complicated timing functions. There's this thing called a cubic bisector, which is like a very complicated mathematical curve. So you can have a timing function looking like this. I'll refresh. And this timing function is just doing some wild stuff that honestly is just not necessary for most everyday application. I wouldn't worry too much about all these different timing functions, and for now I would just stick to not even specifying one and having the default value of ease. But timing functions are just something you need to know about. So let's now take a look at some transitions guidance. Transitions on buttons add subtle visual feedback. For example, on this web page here, the primary button translates when you hover over it. That is, it moves to the right. And this translation doesn't happen instantly because a transition is being applied so that the change is more subtle. Let's check this out in the browser. So I'm on the web page here. I'm going to hover over this primary button, and you'll see it moves to the right, but doesn't happen instantly as a transition is being applied to move it gradually. Here's another example of a transition being applied on a button. When I hover over it, you'll see a shadow appears, and again, it's not appearing instantly because a transition has been applied, which almost makes it look a bit animated. The next piece of guidance is that transitions can make card components pop. For example, on this web page here, when you hover over one of these cards, they rotate. And the rotation doesn't happen instantly, but it's smooth and gradual. Let's check this out in the browser. So when I hover over these cards, you'll see they each rotate, but the rotation isn't happening instantly, as the transition helps gradually rotate the cards, giving a really cool animated effect. On this web page, transitions are also being applied on these cards here. When I hover over it, the background color and font color change, and there's a subtle transition so that this change doesn't happen instantly. So let's now finish building our summary card, shadows and transitions. In this chapter, we looked at transitions, where a transition creates a smooth, gradual change to an element undergoing a state change. The CSS property looked like this, where we had 3 different values. The first value is the property we want to undergo a transition. The second value is the duration of the transition. And the third value is the timing function. We saw some important notes, where the first value defaults to all properties if none are set. The duration is the only value actually required. And for the timing function, it defaults to ease if none set. We also spent some time discussing timing functions, where timing functions control the speed of the transition. And some common values we looked at were ease, linear, ease in, ease out, and ease in out. And I mentioned I wouldn't worry too much about these, as they're just a bit overkill, and the default value of ease will work perfectly fine in most of your projects. Alright, so I'm back inside the Quill project, and we're finally up to adding our last property. At the moment, our buttons, when we hover over them, are scaling and have a shadow applied, but this is currently happening instantly. So let's just go add a simple transition onto them to smooth this out. The transition is added onto the initial state and not the hover or active state. Now, the best place to add the transition is on the link and visited pseudo class for each button. We don't want to add the transition on this button class here, as these properties have much more to do with the actual structure of the button. We want to come and add the transition on the link and visited pseudo class. So I'll grab transition, and all I'm going to do is add a 0.5 second duration. I'll refresh, and you'll see now when I hover over the button, the state change is just a lot smoother. So I'm now just going to copy this transition declaration and add it onto the link and visited state for each of our different buttons. So I'll add it here for our outline button, and I'll add it here for our secondary button. I'll refresh and let's go try them all out. There's a nice smooth transition, again a nice smooth transition, and for our secondary button down the bottom, again a nice smooth transition. Now once again, I don't want to be adding a transition over here because this handles all our button structures. It's better practice to add it here, as it gives us precise control over the transition for each button type. Alright, we are now finished the Quill project. Let's go full screen and check it out in all its glory. Now if this is your first web page, and you've understood all the concepts we've gone through, this is a fantastic start. We've used CSS to build a fully responsive, well-designed page that follows CSS best practices. So amazing work on being able to finish this project. That's shadows and transitions ticked off the list. You've unlocked the ability to enhance your designs with depth and fluid animations. It's now time to move on to the last topic of the CSS full course, where we'll be doing a deep dive into CSS frameworks. CSS frameworks provide pre-built styles and components to help you quickly create responsive, well-designed web pages. We'll explore the most popular frameworks, Bootstrap and Tailwind, and see how to use their pre-designed components and utilities to speed up web design in CSS. So before we finish the last topic, I just wanted to quickly let you know a bit more about my mission at Future Full Stack. Future Full Stack has been built to be the world's best online full stack web development bootcamp that delivers a world-class learning experience at an affordable price. As you've hopefully seen from this course, I value creating incredibly high-quality material that comprehensively covers everything you need to know in a fun and engaging way. The bootcamp is designed for complete beginners with no coding experience, and by the end, you'll be able to build sophisticated full-stack web applications. It's ideal if you're looking to start a career in software engineering or wanting to launch your own dream web applications. This CSS full course you are currently watching is part of this bootcamp, where the same high-quality teaching can be experienced in all other topics. The bootcamp is split into 2 major sections, where first, we cover web development fundamentals, with the topics Introduction to Web Development, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. The second section of the course is Full Stack Development, where we take what we have learned from the fundamentals and extend our knowledge to build a full stack web application. We cover the topics databases, web design, Node, Express, and React. Now, most bootcamps out there build different projects within different topics, often referred to as capstone projects. In this bootcamp, we work on the Quill Major Full Stack project, from the very first video to the very last. This approach is much smarter, as the most challenging aspect of full-stack web development is getting a real understanding of how the front-end, back-end, and database all work together. And you will not be able to see this in smaller topic-based projects. Now, for complete transparency, the fundamentals of the bootcamp will be completely free on YouTube. This means no matter what, you can master HTML, CSS, and JavaScript without spending a cent. If you're serious about learning web development, you'd likely be paying for similar courses on other platforms. But with me, not only will you save money, but you'll also get a superior learning experience at no cost. For those ready to take their skills to the next level, I'm offering the full stack development section as a paid option. Head on over to futurefullstack.com to learn more. While I'd love to give everything away for free, I have a family to support and bills to pay. That said, even with the paid section, you'll still be saving thousands of dollars compared to a traditional bootcamp, while receiving the highest quality learning experience. I hope I've done a good job at convincing you why Future Full Stack is the best option for learning web development. But let's now get back to it. We're going to start off this topic by exploring the fundamentals of CSS frameworks and how they can help you speed up the development process with an introduction to CSS frameworks. I'll first be giving a word of warning. We'll then discuss how CSS frameworks work, and then we'll take a look at the types of CSS frameworks. So first of all, a big word of warning. Do not touch CSS frameworks until you have a solid understanding of CSS fundamentals. Now, when I started out, I was so eager to use CSS frameworks that I jumped into them straight away without fully mastering CSS. And it just becomes a very frustrating experience because you just can't work with CSS frameworks until you really understand the fundamentals of CSS. So to understand this a bit more, we have our web page, and we know that the core of our web page is built in HTML. That is all the content. CSS is then a layer that sits on top of HTML. And you need to know HTML to work with CSS. CSS is all about the styling of HTML elements. And if you don't know about HTML elements, you can't style them. It's the same thing with CSS frameworks. They're a layer that sits on top of CSS. And you need to know CSS to work with frameworks. Just like you couldn't work with CSS without knowing about HTML, the same thing is true with CSS frameworks. You just won't be able to use them properly without understanding CSS properly. Now, as always in this course, I am going to be walking through two very popular CSS frameworks in detail to give you a solid understanding of how they work. But I really do beg you that when you finish this course, don't jump into CSS frameworks. Rather go build a handful of web pages yourself just using regular CSS. I know it's a longer journey to eventually get to a framework, but I promise you it will make your life much easier. So what is a CSS framework? A CSS framework is a ready-made collection of CSS code to simplify and speed up the process of styling web pages. To understand this, let's look at different ways we could build a cupboard. The cupboard is an analogy for a web page. Now, to build a cupboard, we need to work with raw materials. With wooden planks and screws, this represents CSS code. Now, the first way you could build your cupboard is use the raw materials to build it yourself. You could go to the hardware store, buy some wood, some nails, and some other pieces to build your cupboard. But an easier way to do this is going to a store like IKEA. And IKEA represents our framework. For anyone that doesn't have IKEA in their country, IKEA is a very popular furniture store where you can buy items for your home. So say, for example, a cupboard. Let's say we wanted to build this cupboard here. You would go to IKEA and you would purchase a flat pack of materials. If I go over here, product details, assembly and documents, assembly instructions, your flat pack would contain the large wooden pieces and all the bits needed to build the cupboard, like these big and small screws. And you're provided instructions with how to build the cupboard. So with IKEA, raw materials are packaged up by IKEA, and then we use IKEA parts and instructions to build the cupboard. So through this analogy, you can see how using a framework can be a much faster and efficient way of building a cupboard versus doing it yourself from raw materials. So the last thing I want to discuss are the different types of CSS frameworks. CSS frameworks are built around core philosophies. There are three main types of CSS frameworks. The first is component-based. This is where the framework provides ready-made UI parts. These parts are responsive, so out the box, they're ready for all screen sizes, and often contain JavaScript in them, so they are a lot more interactive and respond to user actions. An example of a component is something like a button, where in this class here, we have btn and btn primary, and with these two lines of code, we would be given a button that's already styled for us. The most popular component-based CSS framework is Bootstrap, which we'll be looking at in the next chapter and build a mini project from scratch. The next type of framework is utility-based. Utilities are simple classes for styling. You can see an example of a utility here, MB-8. This stands for margin bottom, and the number 8 represents a particular rem value. And for margin bottom, the values would be MB1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, etc., where each number represents a rem value which is provided in the documentation of the framework. A very popular utility-based framework is Tailwind CSS, which will also be building a mini project after Bootstrap. The final type of CSS framework is CSS in JavaScript. This is where you can work with CSS directly inside JavaScript. Now at this point, that may not make too much sense, but the reason this is helpful is because in a language like React, being able to use CSS inside JavaScript effectively allows you to write HTML, CSS, and JavaScript all within the same document. Now again, that won't make too much sense right now. For now, you just need to know that CSS in JavaScript is just another type of framework. And just to show you, here's a snippet of what it would look like. And again, don't worry at all about the syntax. A very popular CSS in JavaScript framework is styled components. And we're going to be using styled components later on in the React module of the Full Stack Bootcamp. Now, just a small comment. I don't know what's up with this logo. Why is nail polishing the logo for this? I just don't get it. Anyway, one thing you're going to quickly learn in the development community is that it's very quick to learn which tools only have developers on their team, because their logos just kind of suck. Anyway, nowadays, the frameworks integrate core features from other approaches for more flexibility. So while something like Bootstrap is at its core component-based, there are still utilities available. And the same thing with Tailwind. At its core, it is utility-based, but there also are components available. So frameworks today have a core philosophy, but also take good things from other types of CSS frameworks. Now it's time to dive into one of the most widely used component-based CSS frameworks and explore how it simplifies creating responsive and modern web designs using Bootstrap. We'll be discussing what is Bootstrap, why is Bootstrap helpful, we'll be doing a Bootstrap walkthrough, and then we'll work on the Bootstrap homepage project. So what is Bootstrap? Bootstrap is a component-based CSS framework for building responsive websites with pre-designed components and utilities. The component-based is Bootstrap's core philosophy. It's responsive, which means it works across all devices. At its core, it has pre-designed components, which are pieces of UI like buttons, cards, navbars, etc. And it also has utilities, which are simple classes. Bootstrap is very popular and is used by small and large companies. Let's take a look at some example web pages using Bootstrap. Airbnb is an example of a very big company using Bootstrap, and this e-commerce site selling chewable toothpaste bites is also using Bootstrap. So Bootstrap is used on very large applications like Airbnb and smaller applications like Bite toothpaste. So why is Bootstrap helpful? To understand this, I want to look at a little bit of the history of why Bootstrap was developed. Bootstrap was initially developed in response to major limitations in CSS layout features. Bootstrap was actually developed by the team at Twitter and was made open source so people like you and I could use it. Twitter is now Elon Musk's company X. So let's take a look at a quick timeline. The first date I want to look at is 2017. This is when Flexbox and CSS Grid were fully implemented, which means that layouts were very difficult before 2017. Having used both Flexbox and CSS Grid, you know how powerful they are in helping lay out web pages. And you can just imagine how hard it would be to achieve those kind of layouts without these CSS features. So in 2011, Bootstrap was released with its grid system and components. Bootstrap's grid system is different to CSS Grid, but it provided developers with a much easier way of laying out elements on a web page. Bootstrap also gave us a whole array of UI components, like buttons, so you didn't have to write them from scratch. So both the grid system and these pre-built components made coding up web pages a lot easier. Now from 2011, Bootstrap was continually improved by making the framework more responsive and adding more components, up until the present day. Another major date is 2018, where utility classes were embraced in Bootstrap while retaining its component-based structure. Now this was done because the use of utility classes, which we're going to look at in a second, was quickly becoming very popular and was championed by frameworks like Tailwind CSS, which we're going to be looking at in the next chapter. So because of this emerging trend, Bootstrap integrated a lot more utility classes while still maintaining its core component-based philosophy. So let's check out the project we're going to be using Bootstrap to build. It's a simple homepage for my full-stack developer bootcamp. We have an above-the-fold hero section, where we have some heading text, some paragraph text, and 2 buttons. When you scroll down, there's a how it works section with 3 grid items. There's then a frequently asked questions section where an accordion is being used, where you can click on a different menu item. That menu item expands and the other ones contract. So if I click on this one here, it expands and the one above contracts. There's then just a very simple footer. So let's open up DevTools. I'm going to focus on the how it works section over here. You can see that when I reduce the width of the browser, spacing between the grid elements changes until we hit a certain breakpoint, and then the grid items each become stacked one above another with some vertical spacing between them. So through doing this project, let's take a look what we will learn. We're going to first look at installation of Bootstrap. We'll be covering layout by taking a detailed look at Bootstrap's grid system. We'll then add components to our project, like buttons and the accordion menu you saw earlier. We'll then add some various utility classes. We'll look at using Bootstrap's icons. We'll learn about adding custom CSS to extend Bootstrap. We'll be taking a look at responsive design in Bootstrap. And then finally, how we can go about adjusting the visual theme of Bootstrap, like changing the default colors Bootstrap provides. So before we get started, let's take a brief walkthrough of Bootstrap documentation. I'm currently on the homepage, getbootstrap.com. On the navigation bar up here, I'm first going to go to Docs. This is the detailed documentation of how to use Bootstrap. The first menu item here, Getting Started, just contains important information about getting started with Bootstrap. For example, in the introduction, it contains information of how to quickly get started with Bootstrap in your project, which we'll be looking at soon. This next menu heading, Customize, contains documentation of how to customize default Bootstrap styles. For example, if I go to Color, this shows all the different colors used inside Bootstrap, like this gray body color, or this primary blue color. Lower down in this documentation, there's information of how to adjust these colors, something we'll also be looking at in our project. Scrolling down to the next menu item is Layout. This contains important information about Bootstrap's grid system, which is fundamental to how elements are laid out on a page. And we'll be looking at this in a lot more detail in the course. There's also information on breakpoints, which we'll be discussing when talking about responsive design. And Layout also deals with the main page container, which we'll also be looking at soon. The next heading, Content, is about how HTML content is styled in Bootstrap. For example, if I go to Typography, you can see here the default sizing of headings in Bootstrap. The next heading is Forms, which is about how to use forms inside Bootstrap. For example, here's how a drop-down menu would appear, which require a special Bootstrap class. The next heading is all about Components, which is what Bootstrap really prides itself on, and contains all the different pieces of UI we can insert into our project. For example, Bootstrap comes with a whole range of pre-built buttons. Here's the primary button, that blue button here. Here's our secondary button, and you can see all the other button types here. Another example of a component is an accordion, which we're going to be using in our project for our frequently asked questions, where this code over here can just be copied and pasted into your project to give you this accordion menu. And just a note, there's also JavaScript in this, which is the driving force for how this accordion works, where clicking this item is an event which expands this window. And you can't do that in CSS alone. You need JavaScript. Another great example of a popular component is a navbar. If I scroll down here, you can see by pasting all this code here, I can get this fairly sophisticated navbar, which has drop-downs part of it and a form input. So Bootstrap provides a whole bunch of different components that are very helpful for building your project, and I suggest you check these out yourself. Now, of all the menu items we've looked at so far, components is probably one of the most important. Next up, we have helpers, which typically combine multiple styles or behaviors to solve a specific design problem. For example, color and background. This class here, TextBG Primary, gives us a blue background with white text. So there's two different styles being applied in this one rule, both color and background color. Now, in all honesty, I wouldn't worry too much about helpers right now. They're used in very specific circumstances. The next menu item, utilities, is where you'll also be hanging out a lot. Utilities just apply one property at a time through simple CSS rules. For example, if I go to borders, if I scroll down to radius and sizes, you'll see we have these different classes with different rounding. Rounded 0 is just square edges, where incrementing the number increases the amount of rounding. And this is what a utility does. Instead of selecting your element, adding border radius property, and giving it a specific value, Bootstrap allows you just to add something like rounded 2, which gives a slight rounding on your corners. Now, just another small note on how Bootstrap is laid out. On the right over here, we have a navigation for this particular page. So for example, if I go to color, this is how we can apply different border colors, like border primary and border secondary. The heading extend is just about information for how to extend Bootstrap. And the last menu item, about, like the name suggests, is just information about Bootstrap. Now I also want to show you that something very powerful in Bootstrap is this search box here. So say for example, I want to apply some margin. I can easily just search margin here. You can see the heading spacing appears. If I click margin and padding, it will take me straight to that section of the documentation. So the search box over here is usually your first port of call for finding documentation on different components or utility classes or anything else inside Bootstrap. Let's now take a look on the navigation bar at examples. Examples provides you with entire sections you can download. For example, if I go down to pricing under custom components, I can get the source code in Bootstrap for this entire pricing section. Or over here is a checkout. So you can imagine how long it would take to code this up. But with Bootstrap, you can just download this and put it straight into your project. And of course, you can customize this how you like. For example, you could change this color or increase the heading size. All you do is click download examples. This will download all the different examples on your device. And then you just need to go find which one you want. For example, this pricing page over here. All I need to do is add the pricing folder into VS Code. I could then copy all this HTML, which as you can see, contains a whole bunch of Bootstrap-specific classes, as well as add the custom style sheet to the project. The next item I want to look at is icons. Bootstrap have a whole array of icons you can easily import into your project, so you don't have to go to another source to add your icons. And Bootstrap makes it really simple to add these icons with a special Bootstrap HTML tag. And we'll be doing this in our project. The final menu item I want to look at is themes. Now, themes provides you with code for an entire web page, not just a section. Now, for a lot of these, they are paid. So for example, you could use Bootstrap to build an online supermarket. If I click Live Preview, this page contains the information about the template. You can see there's a whole bunch of different home pages you can get. And there's also a range of other pages and components. For example, this quick view element over here, there's UI components for ratings, a price range, drop-downs, and there's also whole pages for other sections of the site. For example, a shopping grid which is filtered, which you can see over here. If I go purchase, under the description, I'm given the list of all the features I would get as part of this package. And of course, I can go and add and extend the pages and components using Bootstrap. All right, so let's make a start on our project. In VS Code, I'm going to go open a new folder. On my desktop, I've previously created a folder called Bootstrap, which is currently empty. And I'm just going to open this inside VS Code. Okay, inside the Bootstrap folder, I'm going to create a new file called index.html. I'm straight away going to grab our boilerplate by hitting !enter. Let's update the title of the HTML document to Future Full Stack. And just to start off with, I'm going to add a simple H1 with the title Bootstrap. So let's check this out in the browser. All right, you can see Bootstrap has appeared. And at the moment, we just have the default browser styles in terms of properties like font family, font size, as well as default margin and padding on the page. So step one is let's go add Bootstrap to our project. To do that, I'm going to go to the Bootstrap homepage. I'm going to go to Docs, and I'm straight away taken to the Get Started with Bootstrap page. I'm going to scroll down. Step one was create a new index.html file, which we've already done. Step two is include Bootstrap's CSS and JavaScript. There's specific instruction of where to place this. Place the link tag in the head for our CSS and the script tag for our JavaScript before the closing body tag. So I'm just going to copy this link tag, which I need to paste under the title in our head. So I'll jump back, and under the title, I'm just going to pop that link tag. And then the script tag, which is for JavaScript, I'm going to paste that just before the closing body tag. So in our markup, that would be over here. So let's check what this has done for us. I'm going to refresh the page, and you'll see the font style has completely changed. Bootstrap has now taken over the styling and has applied its text properties. Bootstrap has also done a kind of CSS reset, whereby default margin and padding have also been removed from the browser. So adding an initial H1 is a good way to see that Bootstrap is working. And just to show you what's actually being imported through this link over here, if I just copy this URL and go to it in my browser, you'll see this is the actual Bootstrap code that is being imported into our project. And it contains all the different properties and values that Bootstrap is using behind the scenes. Now on this tab over here, I have our completed project, which I'll keep referring to as we build out each section. The first thing I want to do is add our main page container. So I'm going to head over to the docs. In layouts, there's containers, and this documentation explains how containers work. Now, there are actually different kinds of containers. It's summarized in this table here. The standard container, which has the class container, shows you the width of the container at different breakpoints. Bootstrap has 6 inbuilt breakpoints. There's extra small, which is less than 576 pixels, small, greater than 576 pixels, medium, greater than 768 pixels, large, extra large, and XX large. Now, we might be used to thinking about breakpoints in terms of a specific range, as opposed to just a greater than or equal to value. And when we cover responsive design a bit later, we'll be talking more about this. But for now, this is how we need to understand the table. Our regular container class, for screen sizes less than 576 pixels, will just be 100% of the page. And for each of these other breakpoints, you can see the width of the page. Now let's take an example for how to read this. For anything greater than 992 pixels, up into 1200 pixels, our container width will be 960 pixels. So for now, just see large as a range between 992 and 1200. And as I mentioned, we're going to be talking more about why these are greater than or equal values as opposed to specific ranges. But you can see as you move down the table, you can use a class like container XXL or extra large, which for most breakpoints has the container width at 100%. Except for extra large screens greater than 1400 pixels, the container width will remain at 1320 pixels. Okay, so for our project, we're just going to use the standard container class. So I'm going to copy this back in index.html. I'm going to come and add a div, which is going to be the div for our main container. So I'll add a class and I'll add the word container. Just to show you that this is working, let's just pop in our temporary H1 inside this container. So let's now check this out. I'm going to refresh and you can see Bootstrap moves in slightly to the right. And that's because our container is being applied. Let's open up DevTools. I'm going to click on this toggle device icon. I'm going to come and reduce the width of the browser. And you can see we have a container, which is always less than the browser width, until we hit a breakpoint where the container then stretches 100%. And that's this breakpoint over here. When we're less than 576 pixels, the container will stretch to 100% of the browser width. So let's see that value come into play. Watch over here as I reduce down to 576 pixels. You'll see now at 578, let's scroll very slowly. And at 575, you'll see the container disappears, and we're now stretching 100% of the browser width. Just a small note, there is a tiny bit of padding on our container, which we can see in the box model here, of 12 pixels left and right. Okay, just going to close DevTools. Heading back to the completed page, let's now go add all this content in our HTML. So I'm just going to first remove this placeholder H1. Let's now add in a new H1. Now, just to avoid boring you, I've already copied the text, so it's sitting in my clipboard. In the description below, I have provided a Google Doc, which contains all the content, so you can also just copy and paste it. Now, just a note, this icon I didn't copy, and we'll be talking about how to add that in a bit later. I'll next grab a paragraph tag, and I'll just paste in the content. And then we have these 2 buttons. Those 2 buttons are being structured in an unordered list. We then have a list item, which contains an anchor tag. The text of the first anchor tag is get started. And for now, I'm just going to put a hash as we don't have any other pages to point it to. I'm then going to copy this list item and change its text to learn more. Now this content is the hero section of our page, so I'm going to use some semantic elements to better structure this. I'm just going to cut it for now. I'm going to add a header, as is good practice for your page to have a header, a main section, and footer, and we'll add those other two structural elements soon. And inside the header, I'm going to add a section tag, which is specifically for our hero section. I'm then just going to paste in the content for the hero section we just wrote earlier. So this is what we have so far: our heading, paragraph, and unordered list for our anchor tags. So let's quickly discuss what Bootstrap is using for its sizing of different text elements. If I go to the documentation and scroll down to utilities and click on text, and then scroll down to this section of the page talking about Sass variables, this contains the variables behind the scenes of the different font sizes. You can see there's this variable called font size base, which is 1 rem, and this assumes the browser default, typically 16 pixels. This font base is then being applied to different text elements. So for example, our headings over here are just a multiple of this font size base. So for example, our H1 is 2.5 times 1 rem, or 2.5 times 16 pixels, which is 40 pixels. You can see this also contains other variables for other text properties, like font weight normal being 400, or font family serif, which lists the prioritized list of different font families. Now, you might be wondering exactly what Sass is. Behind the scenes, Bootstrap is built in something called Sass. Sass is an extension of CSS and just has this notation for variables with a $sign. Now, I wouldn't worry too much about Sass. The reason Sass was ever on the scenes was because CSS lacked some important features. For example, in previous versions of CSS, you couldn't actually define variables. But with modern CSS, you can. So today, there's just less of a need for Sass. But Bootstrap behind the scenes is built in it. So that's why you'll see some scary notation with this $sign. I just wanted to show you what's happening behind the scenes so you do know where these values are coming from. Okay, let's head back to our project. The next thing I want to do is remove these bullets from our anchor tags. Back in the documentation, I'm going to head to the content section, go to typography. I'm going to scroll down, and you can see there's this section dealing with lists. You can see under unstyled that this class list unstyled is effectively removing the bullet points from the list items. So I'm just going to copy this class. Back in our project on our unordered list, I'm going to add the class and paste in list unstyled. I'll refresh, and you can see those bullets have now been removed from the list items. Let's now style these anchor tags as buttons. We're going to do that by using our first component. I'm going to scroll down to the components, and I'm going to click buttons. The way Bootstrap does this is exactly how we did it in our Quill project. There's this base BTN class, which sets the structure of the button, and then we just add on a specific style that deals with color and background color. And another variation like BTN success has a green background with white text. So for our primary button, I'm going to copy this class here. In our project, for the anchor tag, I'm going to add a class and paste in that class. For our secondary button, I'm going to copy this class here. I'll add the class tag and paste that in. Okay, back in our browser, I'll refresh, and you'll see straight away we now have buttons by just using a single class. And this is a great example of how easy Bootstrap makes it to use pre-built components. All right, continuing on our completed page, our hero section is all above the fold. And I'm setting 100 view height units on the hero section to achieve this layout. Okay, view height is a unit, and I'm going to scroll down to utilities over here. And view height is about sizing. So I'm going to click here. The first part, relative to the parent, deals with utilities for percentages. If I scroll down here, relative to the viewport, you can see this class here, VH100, is what we want to use. So I'm going to copy that. Inside our HTML, on the hero section, I'm going to add a class and set it to VH100. So let's check this out in the browser. Now there's not going to appear to be a change here, but if I open up DevTools and I come and select the section, you'll see this blue background extends the full height of the page, confirming that we have set 100 view heights on the hero section. Now, just a comment at this point, you'll see under sizing, we only have view height units for 100. Now, not that you'd want to do this for a hero section, but if I did want to use a value of VH75, that is 75% of the viewport, I just can't do that using Bootstrap. And this is where some of the limitations of Bootstrap comes in. While there are utilities that are provided out the box like this, usually in a project, you have to go and add your own custom CSS. So let's check out how we would do that. In our project, I'm going to come and add a new style sheet called app.css. I'll head back to index.html, and under the link tag importing Bootstrap into our project, we're going to come and add our custom style sheet. Now, it's really important that this style sheet goes after the Bootstrap one, because we initially want all our Bootstrap styles to load in, and then we're adding or overriding these with any of our custom styles. So I'll add app.css. What I could then do is define my own custom utility called vh75. And the height would just be 75 view height units. And then I could use this custom class inside my project. So at index.html, let's change this to my custom class of 75. Let's check it out in the browser. I'll refresh. I'll select the section, and you can now see that the height of the hero section is 75% of the viewport height. Okay, I'm just going to change it back. Now, we're not actually going to be using this in our project, so I'm going to remove it. But coming up soon, we are going to have to add our own custom styles to achieve our desired design. Okay, the next thing I want to tackle is getting our content centered vertically and horizontally in our page. And to do that, we're going to use Flexbox. Heading back to the Bootstrap documentation. So in addition to the menu items down the left here, we can also use this search box, which is pretty powerful. If I click search and type flex, you can see properties with Flexbox come up. So let's first click enable flex behaviors. This takes us to the utilities section and the Flexbox chapter. So in the documentation, the way we enable Flexbox is through the utility class dFlex. This is like adding display flex. Let's scroll down. We can set flex direction with flex row reverse, and for column, flex column, and flex column reverse. And note that you have dFlex still there. So it's very common in Bootstrap to use multiple utility classes to achieve what you want. So looking at where we currently are, we have all this content inside a div container, which is contained inside the hero section, which currently has 100 view height units. So what we want to do is center this div container horizontally and vertically to achieve this layout. Back to the Flexbox documentation, we're going to be using the justify content property, which aligns flex items along the row axis. And we're going to want to center it along the row axis. So we're going to be using justify content center. We also want to center our div container vertically. So to do that, we're going to be using the align items property, which aligns items along the cross axis. And we want to center it using align items center. So let's jump back into our HTML. All right, so let's come and add our Flexbox utilities to vertically and horizontally center all of this content. Inside our section, I'm going to activate Flexbox with dFlex. I then want all this content to go vertically down the page. So we need to change the flex direction to column. We use the utility flex column. And then I want to horizontally and vertically center all our content on the page. Our main axis is now running from top to bottom, which means to vertically center our content, we're going to be using justify content center. Our cross axis is running from left to right. So to center our flex items horizontally, we're going to be using align items center. Okay, I'll refresh and let's check out this change. Great, so now our content is now appearing perfectly centered in our hero section. Because our text is wrapping onto two lines, both the heading and paragraph, inside the flex item, it's left aligned. So we want to go and center that. Jumping back to the documentation, if I search text center and click this first option here, you can see this is all about text alignment, where we want to use the text center class. Back in our file, on our H1, I'm going to add text center, and I'm also going to add text center on our paragraph. Let's check this out. Okay, great. Our text is nicely centered, and all our content is centered vertically and horizontally on the page. Let's now go sort out these buttons, and we're going to be again using Flexbox to get them next to each other and add some small gap. In the documentation, I'm going to search gap. I'll click this first option, and you can see here the gap property with a hyphen and a number. Now this is being applied to grid, but we can use the same property on flex items. Now, what is this gap -3? So just like we saw earlier with font size, with spacing properties, specifically gap, margin, and padding, which we're going to be adding soon, they all have these numbers added after the property. I'm going to scroll down in the documentation, and under this heading Sass maps, this is how the spacing is defined. This is back to those Sass variables we spoke about earlier, where effectively we're taking one rem, which is 16 pixels, and multiplying it by different numbers. So for example, gap 0 would be 1 rem times 0, which would be 0. Gap 1 would be 1 rem times 0.25. So that's 0.25 times 16 pixels or 4 pixels. Gap 2 would be 0.5 times 16 pixels, which would be 8 pixels. Gap 3 is just 1 rem, or 16 pixels. Gap 4 is 1 rem times 1.5, so that's 16 pixels times 1.5, which would be 24 pixels. And gap 5 is 1 rem times 3, which is 3 times 16 pixels, which is 48 pixels. Now, this is again a fairly big limitation with utilities in Bootstrap. This is where they stop. If you want to add larger values of margin, using this kind of notation, you have to extend it yourself with your own custom CSS. Now for us, we only need a small gap value, so we can use the values provided. But later on, when it comes to things like padding and margin, like between these different sections, we are going to need to define our own custom margin utilities. So for now, I'm just going to be using gap 3 on our buttons. So jumping back to our HTML file, we need this unordered list to become a flex container where the list items are the flex items. So let's activate Flexbox by adding dflex. We want our buttons to remain in a row, so we don't need to add flex column. We don't need to do any alignment using justify content or align items. We just need to add a small gap value between our buttons. I'll use the value gap 3 for now, and we'll see how this looks. Jumping back into our page, I'll refresh, and this looks pretty good. Our buttons are now in a row with a small gap value between them. If I open up DevTools, let's go see this gap value. You can see the gap is set as 1 rem. And that's being taken from what we looked at before, where the 3 value represents 1 rem. Alright, our hero section is nearly complete. The last thing we need to do is just add this icon at the end of the heading. Now Bootstrap actually provides a whole library of icons that are really easy to import into your project. If I go to icons over here, it takes me to a subdomain of Bootstrap, icons.getbootstrap.com. Now I'm going to scroll down to where it says install over here, and it's going to take me to the bottom of the page. Under CDN, I now need to add in our project a specific style sheet to access these icons. I'm just going to copy this link over here. Back in our HTML file, I'm going to scroll up, and underneath the link tag importing Bootstrap, I'm going to paste in the link tag to import the icons. Now having done that, it's really easy to now add icons to our project. I'm using a laptop icon, so I'm going to search laptop. This is the icon I'm using here, so I'll click it. And then all I do is copy this special syntax, which has an I tag. I'll copy it. Back inside our HTML, inside our heading 1 tag, I'm just going to paste this icon. Now it's really important that this icon goes inside the heading 1, because this icon is being treated as kind of a text element. So styles that are applied on the H1, like the font size, will also now be applied on the icon. So I'll save this, and let's check it out in the browser. I'll refresh, and our icon now appears on the heading. Now we just need to add a small space between the word bootcamp and the icon. So back inside the HTML, I'm just going to pop a space there. I'll save and refresh. Alright, that's our hero section complete. So up to now, you've had a good taste with how to use components like buttons, and how to use different utility classes like activating Flexbox, and different text properties like Text Center. For the next section, we're going to come and use Bootstrap's grid layout, which is fundamental to how Bootstrap is structured. So back inside our HTML file, our header is complete. So let's now go and add our next semantic element for the main content of the page using the main tag. This main tag will contain both the features section with how it works, as well as the frequently asked questions over here. So I'm going to add 2 sets of section tags. The first section tags will be for the how it works section, and the second section tags will be for the frequently asked questions that we'll get to soon. So the first thing I want to do is add this how it works text, and I want it centered on the page. So inside the section, I'm going to use an H2. The text is how it works, and then I'm going to come and add a class and use the utility value we used earlier, text center, to horizontally center the text on the page. So I'll refresh, and we can now see down here below the fold, we have how it works, centered on the page. Looking back at the completed project, you can see that between how it works and this grid section, there is some margin between them. So I'm going to come and add some margin bottom onto the how it works. Back in Bootstrap, I'm going to search margin, and you can see margin and padding come up here. And the documentation here explains how we can use margin and padding properties. The way it works is you first select your property type, whether it's margin or padding, M for margin, P for padding. You then come and append on a specific letter, depending on what you're trying to achieve. For example, MB would be margin bottom, whereas something like MX sets both margin left and right. So for us, we're going to be using MB for margin bottom, and then you come and use one of the numerical values we looked at earlier, ranging from 0 to 5. So let's add this to our project. In our class over here, I'm going to write MB for margin bottom, and I'm going to use the maximum value available, which is 5. Back in our project, I'm going to refresh, and you'll see some margin bottom has now been added to the H2. Let's confirm this in DevTools. If I select the H2, you can see the orange box appearing below to signify that margin has been added below. So the next thing we're going to go do is define this grid section, where we have 3 grid items. Now, as I've mentioned a few times now, Bootstrap's grid feature is fundamental to how the framework is structured. On the navigation bar on the left here, if I go to Layout Grid, this documentation explains how the grid system works. So you can see over here, we use our powerful mobile-first Flexbox grid to build layouts of all shapes and sizes thanks to a 12-column system. So what is this 12-column system? So the way it works is you add the class row on what you want your grid container to be. This then activates Bootstrap's special grid system. And the way it works is that inside this grid container, you have 12 equal columns. You then define a grid item with this class col. So in this case, what's happening, we have our grid container with row, which is all this content here. And then there's 3 columns being defined by these 3 divs. Now the grid has 12 columns. So if you were to just define 3 columns, effectively what's happening is that each column would be taking up 4 of those columns from the 12 columns. Now that can be a bit tricky, so let's check out what I mean in our project. I'm going to come and add a div, and I'm going to give it the class of row. This now creates a grid container. This grid container has 12 slots on it. I'm going to come and add a div here. I'm going to give it the class col to signify that this is a grid item, and I'm just going to give it a bunch of lorem text. Now let me copy this to give a total of 3. Now to explain this, let's check it out in the browser. So what I've effectively done is I've defined a grid. This grid has 12 columns as part of it, but because I've only set 3 columns, mathematically what's happening is that each of these divs is going to use 4 of those columns from Bootstrap's grid system. So this is using 4 columns, this is using 4 columns, and this is using 4 columns, giving us a total of 12. Now let me copy these and paste them. So in our markup, we have 6 columns, and from Bootstrap's perspective, its 12 columns now need to be divided into 6, which means that to get to 12, each of these grid items is using 2 of Bootstrap's columns. Let's check this out in the browser. I'll refresh, and you can see we now have 6 columns, each of which are using 2 columns of the 12 inside the grid system. And of course, I could double this one more time. I'll copy it and paste it here. Now we have 12 columns, which would each be using 1 column from Bootstrap's grid system. So I'll refresh. So what we can now see is Bootstrap's 12-column system, where we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 columns. I'm going to open up DevTools. I'm going to select where we're defining this row, and you can see these purple dashes outline the 12-column system, where the number of grid items in here will distribute those 12 columns differently, where we saw, for example, only having 3 of these distributed 4 units of the Bootstrap grid column to the grid item. Now, I just want to clear these. Let's go back and add only 3 columns. So we'll give it the class of col. I'll add the lorem text, and I'll copy this 2 times. So now we're back to having only 3 columns defined, but Bootstrap is going to distribute 4 slots of its grid system to each of these grid items. So what you're going to see is that these 4 slots will be given to grid item 1, these 4 slots will be given to grid item 2, and these 4 slots will be given to grid item 3. I'll refresh and watch as that happens. Now, just having col like this for each of these divs is just going to take the 12 units and divide it equally. And you can explicitly set this by doing something like col-4. I'll add that on to the other divs. And what this is saying is that for each grid item, give it 4 units from Bootstrap's 12-unit system. Back on our page, I'll refresh and you'll see there is no change. But what these numbers allow us to do is to use the 12 units however we like. So for example, I could give our first column 6 units, our second column I could give 4 units, and our third column I could give 2 units. 6 plus 4 plus 2 equals 12. Let's check this out in the browser, and you'll see now how those 12 units have been distributed between our 3 different columns. Now, the other thing you can do is not even use all the columns. So for example, I could get each of our columns only 2 units. So 2 plus 2 plus 2 is 6. So we're only using half of the 12 available slots. So if I check this out in the browser, you'll see that each grid item only has 2 slots used. And because there's 12 available, they only fill up half the space. If I open up DevTools, and if I click over here, you can see the grid is only taking up half the page, and that's because each column has only been distributed 2 of the slots, and there's 3 of them, so 6 slots have been distributed, and the other 6 on the right are currently empty. Now just a quick note, on this div class, you can see the word flex is here, not grid. And this is because behind the scenes, Flexbox is actually being used to establish Bootstrap's grid. That was mentioned in the documentation, where it says, use our powerful mobile-first Flexbox grid to build layouts. And we're soon actually going to be using Flexbox properties for alignment on the grid in Bootstrap. So looking at our project, what I effectively want to do is have 3 grid items, and I only want them to occupy 3 of Bootstrap's columns, because I specifically want to have space to align them like this. So jumping back into our project, I'm going to come and change col2 to col3 for each of our different grid items. So we're using 3 plus 3 plus 3, which is 9 slots from Bootstrap's 12 slot system, which means there'll be additional space inside our grid to align these items. Jumping back in our project, if I refresh, we now have our grid items with some extra space on the right here. So let's come and distribute that space. Now, as I just mentioned, grid is actually using Flexbox behind the scenes. So we're going to come and use Flex alignment properties under the utilities to distribute the space. For this Flex container, our main axis is in row running from left to right. To align these items along the row axis, we need to use the Justify Content property. So I'm going to come over here and click Justify Content. Looking at the different options here, I want this one here, which is Justify Content Between. And this is the same thing as applying Justify Content with the space between value. Because row is using Flexbox behind the scenes, we don't need to come and apply display flex. We can just add the Justify Content Between utility. If I save and refresh, our columns are now distributed with space between them. All right, so let's move on and swap out this placeholder lorem ipsum text for actual cards containing an image and text. Now, this is actually a component inside Bootstrap. If I head to Bootstrap and go to the Components menu, there's a component called a card. Bootstrap contains a whole bunch of different cards, like one with images, text, and buttons, and more specific cards like this one here with images, text, groups of text, and some anchor tags. For our project, we're just going to be using a simple card, which contains an image and text. So I'm going to copy all of this code here. Inside our project, I'm going to remove this lorem ipsum text, and I'm going to paste the card inside this div, which is setting the column. Okay, so here's our card inside our column. Now, the first thing I want to do is just get rid of this style tag here, which is setting a fixed width of 18 rems. I want the width of our card to just extend the full width of our column. So let's check this out so far in the browser. In our project, I'll refresh, and you can see the card is starting to appear. We have this gray border, a broken image, and some text. Now, for the images in this project, I've just gone to one of my favorite open source image library, Undraw. This first image had to do with a video. So under Browse Now, I went to search and looked for video. And you can see that image over here called YouTube tutorial. You'll see the images contain this blue color, which is the same as our primary color here. Now, to find the hex code of that color, I'll type in the search box primary. I'll click this link here. This page deals with documentation around the different colors on our page. I'm going to scroll down. You'll see over here all colors, where this hex code is our primary blue color. So I'm going to copy this hex code, and then inside Undraw, I click this color swatch icon, and I'll paste in the hex code here. And this then updates all the images to contain that blue color. Now, to avoid boring you, I've already downloaded these illustrations, and you can also grab them in the description below. So then inside our project, I'm going to come and add a new folder called Images, and I'm going to drag the images from my Downloads folder into this Images folder. So now back in our index file, for the source attribute, I'm going to go images/icon1. For the alternate text, I'm just going to write video. So let's check this out in the browser. I'll refresh, and you'll see our icon nicely appears inside this card. Now in our completed project, we have a heading and some paragraph text. So let's go reformat that. Inside this div, I'm just going to come and add an H3, which is the title of the card, with the text high quality. For the paragraph, I'm then just going to update this placeholder text to the text from the final page. Okay, let's refresh and check this out. Okay, this is looking great. We have our image, our heading text, and paragraph text all nicely contained in this card. So now what I'm going to do is copy this entire structure with the col and card. I'm going to remove these other two divs and just paste this twice. So we'll now have the structure for our 3 cards. I'll refresh and you can see it all appears here. So let's now go update the content for the other 2 cards. So this is our second card. We're going to update the image to icon 2. For the alt text, I'm just going to put coding. The H3 text is detailed. And I have sitting on my clipboard the paragraph text for this section, which I'll just paste in. For the third card, the heading is structured. And again, I'm just going to remove this text and paste in what I have in my clipboard. And of course, I also need to update icon 3. You can see how our images and text have updated. Now, one problem you'll see is that because these images are different heights, it's causing our cards to just look a bit funny. If you look at the final project, you'll see that inside our cards, the heading text is all nicely aligned horizontally. So to achieve this, we're going to go and add a minimum height onto our images. Now inside Bootstrap, if I search min height, you'll actually come to learn that there is no Bootstrap utility for minimum height. So we are going to now have to set a custom property. So inside our app.css file, I'm going to go define a new class, min height feature image. I'm going to set this height to 300 pixels. So I'll just copy this text in our index file. For each of our images, inside the class, I'm going to go and add that new property I just created. I'll paste it there, there, and there. So let's refresh. And you'll now see, because our images have a minimum height of 300 pixels, the position of our headings is horizontally consistent. All right, so this is our How It Works section complete. The next section we're going to tackle is the frequently asked questions. Now, the first thing I want to go do is add some margin bottom onto the How It Works section to create some vertical space. Now, back in the documentation with margin, as I mentioned earlier, the largest value we can go up to is this 5, which is 16 pixels times 3, which is 48 pixels. Now, that is not a very large value that you often need for creating white space in your design. So once again, we're going to have to go extend Bootstrap to give us larger margin values. So back in app.css, let's go add a whole bunch of new margin values. The largest one we have access to in Bootstrap is the value 5, which is 48 pixels. And that's 3 times by 16 pixels. So let's go add a new value, MB6, which we're going to define margin bottom, and I'm going to make it 64 pixels, which is 4 times 16 pixels. Let's go add MB7. We'll give it margin bottom of 80 pixels, which is 5 times 16 pixels. Now I'm going to continually increment our MB value by 1 and increase each margin bottom value by 16 pixels. So to avoid boring you, I'm just going to go add those all now. Okay, I've added all the values now up until MB12, which has a margin bottom value of 160 pixels. And I've also just put a small inline comment next to each value so you know where it's coming from. So I'm going to grab this MB12 value, and back in our HTML file, on our How It Works section, I'm going to come and add a class and add MB12. Back in our project, I'll refresh, and we now have 160 pixels of margin below this section. All right, so for the frequently asked questions section, let's go add that heading text. In our HTML file, we're now in this section over here. I'm just going to copy this H2 from the previous section, as I still want the text to be centered, and I also want it to have some small margin bottom on it. I'm just going to change the text to FAQ. So let's check this out. You can see our FAQ has appeared with some small margin below it. So next up, we're going to use Bootstrap Grid to define a container and center it. Okay, so let's go set up our grid structure. I'm going to add a div. I'm going to add the class row, which activates Bootstrap's grid layout. And then I'm just going to add a single div, which I'm just going to put some lorem text in for now. And I'm going to give this the class of col. And I want it to use 8 units of Bootstrap's 12 units from its grid system. So let's check this out in the browser. I'll refresh. And you can see this text is using 8 units of the 12 available units from Bootstrap's grid. If we inspect this in DevTools, and I select this row, You can see the purple dashed space on the right are the additional 4 columns which are unused. Now in our final design, we're using this UI element called an accordion, where by clicking different menu items, they expand where the previous one contracts. And JavaScript is actually being applied to achieve this. You need JavaScript because the browser is responding to user actions. By me clicking something, things on the page are changing, and JavaScript is needed for that. Back in the Bootstrap documentation, under Components, there's an accordion, where you can see a sample over here. I'm going to copy all of this markup. I'm going to pop back to our file. I'm going to remove this lorem ipsum text, but keep our div col structure. And I'm going to paste in the accordion. So now our accordion is inside our column. Let's check this out in the browser. I'll refresh, and you can see the accordion now appears here. Now let's go and center this accordion. Like we saw earlier, behind the scenes, Bootstrap Grid is actually using Flexbox. Our row, which acts as the flex container, contains a single flex item, this div over here. The main axis, by default, is in row, going from left to right, which means that to horizontally center this, we need to use a justify content value. So back in Bootstrap, let's go search justify content, and we want our single div to be centered. So we're going to be using justify content center. So inside our row here, which acts as our flex container, I'm just going to come and add justify content center. I'll refresh, and you'll see the accordion centers on the page. Now in our final design, there's also some margin between this entire section and the footer. So let's go add that in our project. I'm going to use this same large value over here, MB12 we used on our how it works section. So I'm just going to copy that. For our FAQ section, I'm going to add a class and add MB12. I'll refresh, and you'll see now there's a lot more white space between the FAQ section and where eventually our footer will appear. All right, let's go update the content of this accordion. The accordion main text appears here. For the first one, it is who is this bootcamp for? The content is then inside this div tag. I'm just going to remove all the content here. And from my clipboard, I'm going to paste in the correct text. Let's check that out. I'll refresh, and you'll now see we have the correct content. Now, just to avoid boring you, I'm going to go update accordion item 2 and its respective text, and accordion item 3 and its respective text. Okay, I've gone ahead and updated that content. Let's check it out on the page. I'll refresh, and you'll see this all looks really great. Now, in our final design, we had an additional accordion menu item. So let's go see how we can add that. Each accordion item is contained inside this div here. So I'm going to simply copy it and paste it over here. Now, for this to work, we do need to go update a value in a few places. You can see there's this data BS target hashtag collapse 3. Anytime we have the word 3, we need to now change that to 4. So I'll copy 4, I'll update it here, and I'll update it here. I'll then come and update the text, which is, do I need any prior knowledge to join? And then in my clipboard, I have the answer. Okay, I'll save that. Let's refresh. And you can see now we have that 4th accordion item, which works perfectly that when I click it, it also closes the other ones. Okay, great. That's our FAQ section done. The final section of the page is this simple footer down the bottom. Now, one thing I want you to notice is that the background color is actually extending the full width of the page. So to do that, I actually want our footer to appear outside this main div container. So I'm going to come below here. I'm going to add our footer. And inside my clipboard, I have the content, which is the copyright symbol, 2025 Future Full Stack. For the footer, let's give it a class. I want to use the primary blue background color. So inside Bootstrap, I'm going to search background color. We can simply apply the class BG primary. So I'll copy that. I'll add BG primary. We want our text to be white. So I'm just going to search the color property. And you can see down here, we just have text white. So I'll copy that class there. I'll add it in there. I then want the text to be centered. So I'm going to use the utility class text center. And the final thing I want to do is have some vertical padding on this text. Back in Bootstrap, we'll search padding. Padding uses the same notation as margin in terms of combining different letters. For padding, I'm going to use P. And I actually want to apply, in this case, padding top and bottom. So I'm going to use this Y value here. And I just want to apply a small value of padding like 2. So I'm just going to write PY-2. I'll refresh. And you can see we now have our nice simple footer at the bottom of the page. Okay, I just wanted to make a small note about the footer and our container. Now, this markup we have isn't the best practice. When you know elements are going to be extending beyond the container, like this footer, what you instead want to do is actually place the container on each section. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to totally remove this div and move the closing div tag here. And then I'm going to add the container onto each section. So for our hero section, we'll come and add the container class there. For our how it works section, I'm going to add the container class there. For the frequently asked questions section, I'm going to add the container class there. And then I'm just going to re-indent our HTML. So now this markup is just a bit cleaner. We have our header, main body tag, and footer all in line. And if I go back to the page and refresh, you'll see there is no change. But now the container, instead of being applied globally, has been applied to each section. All right, so our page is complete and looks great on desktop. However, if I inspect and click on the toggle device toolbar, you'll see that we're now going to run into problems on smaller devices, where, for example, this grid is just breaking now. You'll also notice that when I reduce the width of the browser, text properties and spacing are not changing. Now, usually in a CSS file, you'd be controlling that with changing the root HTML's font size, and because all these values would be in rems, they would adjust accordingly. So let's go see how we can use Bootstrap's responsive classes to help fix this grid layout for smaller screens, as well as change some different property sizes for different screen sizes. So let's go take a look now at responsive design documentation inside Bootstrap. On our navigation bar here, I'm going to go to Layout and Breakpoints. Under Core Concepts, you'll see the sentence about mobile-first responsive design is the goal. The way breakpoints and responsive design works in Bootstrap is that you first need to think about your design on mobile and then work your way up to desktop. Now, the way responsive design works in Bootstrap is that we have these different values for different breakpoints. And the way we need to think about it is that we start at mobile and apply the default value we want, and then that applies until we then change it with another one of these values. So for example, thinking about extra small screen sizes first, less than 576 pixels, we might want our H1 to have a font size of 40 pixels. That font size would then apply for the tier above it, that is SM, and the tier above it, MD. But then if we set a font size for LG, like 70 pixels, it means that anything above 992 pixels would now take on that new font size. So basically the way it works, you start with what you want your design looking like for extra small screens, that is less than 576 pixels. And then for when you want it to change, you take the breakpoint, like MD, and the property, like font size, and change its value. So let's go do this for our grid. So at the moment, our grids are being defined by col3. We have one here, and one here. Now we need to think about our grid starting at mobile and working our way up to desktop. At the moment, if I go to a small screen size, we still have our grid occupying 3 units of the 12 available units. What we actually want is one grid item to take up all 12 units, so that our grids stack on top of each other. So what I'm going to do is actually update col3 to col12, because I need to take a mobile-first approach. I'll copy that and paste it for the other grid items. I'll refresh, and you'll now see that our grid items are appearing on top of each other. And that's because they're now occupying all 12 columns of Bootstrap's 12-column layout. So this looks great for mobile. But this rule is being applied to every single screen size. So as I expand the window, you'll see that we still have this grid item occupying 12 units. But at some point, we actually want to break this so that we do get our grid, with our 3 grid items in one row. So if I go back to breakpoints, what I want to happen is that when I hit the medium screen size, that is greater than 768 pixels, I want our grid to now occupy 4 units of the 12. And then when it hits large, that is greater than 992, I want it to occupy 3 units from the 12. And this will get us back to the original layout we had. So to implement this, what we do is I come here, I add col, then the breakpoint, MD, and then the value 4. I'll copy this, paste it there, and paste it here. So what this is effectively saying is that using a mobile-first approach on small screens, we're going to be using all 12 units of the grid, And then when we hit the MD breakpoint, which is 768 pixels, our grid is going to then use 4 units of the 12. And this will continue up for all screen sizes. That's why it's greater than 768 pixels. So let's go back to mobile. I'll refresh. I'll expand the browser width. And as soon as I hit 768 pixels, you'll see we're now back to a grid layout, where each grid item is occupying 4 units of the 12. Now this works well for medium screen sizes, but for larger screen sizes, I want to go back to having space between our items. So now for large screen sizes, that is above 992 pixels, I'm going to go back to what we originally had. So I'm going to come here, I'm going to add col-lg for large, and now the value 3. So I'll copy that and add it onto each grid item. Okay, I'll refresh, and now you'll see we're back to the original layout we had. So let's go back to the beginning. We take a mobile first approach and apply the value we want. In this case, col12, because we want our grid items to expand the full width of the grid container. We then hit our medium breakpoint, where our grid items occupy 4 of the 12 units. And then we hit our large breakpoint, where the grid items occupy 3 of the 12. And because there's no further breakpoint defined after this, this design just remains for no matter how large the screen is. So let's check this out again. Our grid is occupying 12 units until we hit 768 pixels, where then each grid item occupies 4 units. We then hit 992 pixels, where the grid items then occupy 3 units, and the space between value is now coming into play. So you can see how appending these different breakpoints onto properties like grid column make responsive design really simple. Now, something else I want to take care of using these responsive properties is that on smaller screen sizes, I want to add some margin top and bottom on this grid item so that we have some space between them. Now, I do want to note that this margin I'm going to be adding is not needed at all as soon as we hit the MD breakpoint. I only need it for smaller screen sizes. So the way we do this is that I'm going to come to our middle grid item here, and on the card, I'm going to set margin Y, that is above and below, with the value of 5. So I'll refresh, and you can see we now have space between our grid items vertically. But of course, when I go for larger screen sizes, that margin is still being applied. So we need to turn it off. At the same time, our grid changes from this layout to this layout. We know that's happening at the MD breakpoint. So all we do is start with MY5, and then we say MY for medium screen size, make it 0. So I'll refresh, and you'll see that margin Y now disappears, but it is still being applied for smaller screen sizes. So that's a good example of how you can also use breakpoints to apply different spacing values like margin. All right, so now that we've fixed this issue, I now want to quickly talk about responsive heading text with Bootstrap. I'm going to click on this H1, and you'll see the font size is 2.5 rem. And if you remember earlier, we saw this documentation where H1 font size is the font size base times 2.5, where the font size base is 1 rem. So H1 font size is 2.5 rem, which we can see over here. But watch what happens when I hit a certain breakpoint. The font size changes to this calc 1.375 rem plus 1.5 VW. And you'll see that when I go to computed, the font size is at 40 pixels, and then as I reduce the width of the browser, it continues to scale down, which is being driven from this 1.5 VW unit, which is based on the viewport width. So it's changing as I scale down. So behind the scenes, Bootstrap is actually making our headings responsive. Now, with regard to paragraph text, you'll see there is no actual style being applied here, like we saw with heading. And that's because it's just the base font size of 16 pixels. If I go to computed, you can see the font size is computed at 16 pixels. And no matter what the width, it remains at 16 pixels. Now, I guess this is sensible because you probably don't want your paragraph font size to go much smaller than this, even on smaller screen sizes. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about is overriding the color themes inside Bootstrap. Back in the documentation, on this left navigation, I'm going to go up to Customize and click Color. Now, on the right over here are all the different variables that are used to set the colors inside Bootstrap. So what I want to go do is grab this BS body color, which is setting the base body color for all our text, and I want to go change it. In our custom style sheet app.css, I'm going to come to the top. I'm going to select the root pseudo class. I'm going to paste in the variable, and I'm just going to go change the color. Just to see it's working, let's go change it to something crazy like orange. Let's refresh the browser. So you can now see our heading and paragraph text have been overridden with this orange color. Now this obviously looks awful, so let's go change it to some kind of gray value. Just to find one, I'm going to type gray. The swatch will appear. I'll change it to hex code, and let's go pick a dark gray value like this one. Okay, let's refresh. And we've now manually overridden the Bootstrap body color. Now, when it comes to changing colors like primary colors used in our button, this method won't work. So for example, to change the primary color in our Bootstrap documentation, we have BS primary. So if I copy this, go back to our custom style sheet, paste that in, and let's change the color to something like purple. Just to get a more appropriate hex code, I'll click up here and let's select that color there. Okay, back on our page, let me refresh, and you'll see something like the primary button has not changed. Now, the reason this didn't work is that something like a button is made up of a lot of different properties. So we need to go explicitly define this new primary color on the button. The body color is just changing the color of a single element, like some text, whereas our primary color is used on a lot of different components and elements throughout the application. For example, back in the documentation, we know that our buttons can be primary, secondary, success, etc. But just to show you another example, if I go to alerts, which are little alert pop-ups, that you can see they're also using the same primary, secondary, etc. themes. So this single variable is used in a lot of components, and Bootstrap just doesn't want to give you the power to completely override them all. And it also sees this being applied to a component which is made up of lots of parts, very different to just color on some text. So to make this work, we need to explicitly go add this to the primary button. To do that, we'll select btn primary, we'll add a background color, grab our variable function, and paste in the variable bs primary. I'll save and let's go check this out. I'll refresh, and you'll see our button is now that purple color. You can see the button also has some border around it, so we'd need to update that as well. The border of a button is just 1 pixel, it's solid, and then we're just going to copy and paste the same color. Okay, I'll save that and refresh. And you'll see we've now overridden the color of our primary button, but we had to do it by explicitly declaring it on the primary button. So there you have it. You've just gained a solid foundation in being able to use Bootstrap to build fully responsive pages. We've looked at using utility classes, we've looked at components, we saw how to use Bootstrap's icons, we've added custom CSS to do things like set new values of margins, we've learned about the Bootstrap breakpoints to ensure our design is fully responsive, and we've also just looked at adjusting the visual theme. So walking away from this, you should now have a very solid base with what is Bootstrap and how to use Bootstrap. And as I've recommended, I highly recommend, instead of playing around with Bootstrap right now, rather go ahead and build a handful of pages just using HTML and CSS. Next up, we'll look at the fastest growing utility-first CSS framework that allows for complete flexibility and customization by using Tailwind. We'll be discussing what is Tailwind, why is Tailwind helpful, we'll be doing a Tailwind walkthrough, and we'll be working on the Tailwind homepage project. So what is Tailwind? Tailwind is a utility-first CSS framework for creating custom responsive designs with predefined low-level styles. So let's look at some keywords here. Utility first is the core philosophy of Tailwind, where utilities form the foundation of the framework. This is different to Bootstrap we looked at earlier, which is where components form the foundation of the framework. Responsive refers to the framework being inbuilt to handle all devices. The word predefined means that the special classes we use are systemized, and we're going to see how this works soon. Finally, the word low level means that our utility classes are just single properties, so things like color, font size, or margin. Tailwind CSS is becoming very popular, and for good reason. It's an incredibly powerful and versatile framework. On the Tailwind showcase page, you can see some major applications using Tailwind. OpenAI and ChatGPT use Tailwind, and Shopify, which is one of the world's biggest e-commerce platform, is also using Tailwind. And you can see down here are some smaller applications that are also using Tailwind as their CSS framework of choice. So Tailwind is used by very large companies and smaller companies. Alright, so Tailwind is available at tailwindcss.com. I'm going to head over to Docs, and before we look at these in detail, on this left navigation bar, I want to scroll down to Core Concepts and click on this title, Utility First Fundamentals, to give you an idea of how Tailwind works and how powerful it is. So let's read this together. Traditionally, whenever you want to style something on the web, you write CSS. In this setup here, the documentation is showing us using a traditional approach where custom designs require custom CSS. So this chat component here, we would have our HTML markup, we would set a whole bunch of different classes, and then in our CSS document, we would style all of these different classes to achieve this design. Now let's compare this to how we write this in Tailwind. Tailwind uses utility classes to build custom designs without writing CSS. So this same component is just coded up over here. This is it. The CSS is contained in these different utilities. So for example, BG white refers to the background being white. Over here, text XL is extra large text. So this is a bit interesting. We're kind of writing our CSS inside our HTML. And this might seem counterintuitive to this being useful, because the general rule of thumb is you want your CSS in a separate style sheet. But by using a framework like Tailwind, where styles are systemized, this drastically simplifies our code. You can see we've built the exact same component as above, but the amount of code has drastically reduced. So why is Tailwind helpful? Tailwind overcomes limitations of traditional CSS frameworks and custom CSS by providing more flexibility and customization. Looking at an example component written in CSS, I want to look at 4 reasons why Tailwind is helpful. The first is reusability and consistency. Reusable utilities and design settings ensure a consistent and easy to manage design. So for example, you can see this paragraph has a utility class TextSlate 500. You can see the button has the color TextPurple 600. These are inbuilt styles inside Tailwind, where these classes are reusable throughout the page and provide consistency. The second reason Tailwind is helpful is it helps reducing context switching. By this I mean that styling directly in HTML minimizes the need to switch between HTML and CSS files. So for example, this paragraph over here has large black text which is semi-bold. We don't need to flip between a CSS and HTML file, we can see it all in one place. The third reason is that we're avoiding pre-designed styles. We use low-level utilities allowing for custom designs without needing to override pre-designed components. In the previous chapter, when looking at Bootstrap, it was just a bit frustrating. When using some different components, we often had to customize it. So by using low-level utilities, that is, single property utilities, we never have to go and add our own custom CSS. The Tailwind framework gives us everything in the toolbox we need. For example, this button class has a lot of different styles applied to it. There's some padding, rounding corners, and much more. The final reason is that Tailwind helps simplifying responsive design. Tailwind has built-in responsive and mobile-first utilities, making it easy to create layouts that adapt seamlessly across different devices. To show you an example of this utility class sm::textLeft, where sm: is a special Tailwind responsive utility that's easily applied and avoids us writing more complex media queries. And we'll learn more about this in the project we build. So in a nutshell, Tailwind is just great. I'm a big fan of it because I love their approach, and they're also really slick with how they've designed their documentation and how they've systemized their components. Now, once again, I encourage you not to touch Tailwind until you've played around with regular CSS and built a few projects on your own, because Tailwind especially needs a very strong foundation in CSS. Because at the end of the day, you're still styling using CSS, you're just using these special utility classes, which at the end of the day is just CSS. Alright, so let's take a look at the homepage project we're going to build. I've built this simple homepage for my full stack web development bootcamp Future Full Stack. Our hero section has group text on the left and buttons, and on the right is a picture of me. Scrolling down, we have a how it works section, which contains a grid of icons and text. We then have a CTA section inside this blue box, and then a very simple footer at the bottom. So let's take a look at what we will learn through this project. We're going to be covering Tailwind installation. We're going to be using a whole variety of utility classes. We're going to be using some components so we can see how those work in Tailwind. And then finally, we're going to make our design fully responsive. So before we get started, let's do a quick walkthrough of Tailwind. Tailwind is available at tailwindcss.com. I'm going to head straight to Docs. Straight away, we're taken to Get Started with Tailwind, which provides information of different ways for installing it, which we're going to do soon. If I scroll down on the left, we have the core concepts, where we looked at utility first fundamentals earlier. And then we have a long list of all the different utilities. You can see compared to Bootstrap, there are just way more. And that's because Tailwind is a utility-first framework. There's also a very powerful search box. So for example, if I want to look at margin properties, margin straight away comes up here, and I'm taken to the documentation about margin. And you can see compared to Bootstrap, there are just way more margin utilities. And that's because the aim of Tailwind is to give you everything you need so that you don't need to write custom CSS. And just a side comment, I just think these docs are just so well designed. For example, if I go to background color, which we'll be using in our project, you can see Tailwind out the box has a whole variety of beautiful colors to use. In our CSS bootcamp, we've been using OpenColor. And I did mention that Tailwind Color is another great resource for writing custom CSS. But you can see Tailwind just provides us, straight out the box, some beautiful colors we can use straight away. Anyway, I'm just a big fan of Tailwind's approach to design. So we've briefly looked at docs, let's now go look at components. So while Tailwind is a utility-first framework, it does also provide you with some components. You'll notice that this is actually on a different URL, tailwindui.com. If I go to components and scroll down, the components are organized into different categories. For example, we have a whole bunch of different page sections, like hero sections, CTA sections. And if I scroll down, there's different elements like banners. Now, as an example, let's go to pricing sections. I'm going to zoom out a bit. And you can see Tailwind provides us some different examples of pricing pages. And some of them are pretty comprehensive. Like this one has our 3 different pricing tiers with a table of the different features in each pricing tier. Anyways, there's a whole bunch to choose from here. And what I hope you're noticing is that these designs are absolutely fantastic. Now they're really easy to add to our project. We just go code and copy this to our clipboard and add it in. And we're going to be doing this inside our project, where we'll be copying in a component and customizing the Tailwind CSS so it better matches our design. Now, just a note, this is where Tailwind does make its money. Some of the components you do need to pay for. So the one we just looked at here, I can just straight away grab the code, whereas for other ones, it has this button, Get the Code, which takes me to a pricing page. Now, in addition to different page components, under templates, you can buy full pages. If I go to Browse Templates, I like this one here, Salient. You can see it costs $99, but look what you get. Again, this one does have a cost, but let's check it out. If I go Live Preview, you're able to get this full design written in Tailwind, which you can just copy into your project. And of course, you can further customize it using Tailwind's utility classes. All right, so let's get started on our project. The first thing we need to do is install Tailwind. I'm on the Tailwind CSS homepage. I'm going to go to Docs, and I'm straight away taken to the documentation on installation. Now, in a professional project, you're going to want to install Tailwind as a dependency in your project, using npm Node Package Manager. Now, as this is a beginner CSS course, at this point in your journey, you're not going to have a clue what this is. It's something we're going to be covering in detail in the Node topic in the Full Stack Bootcamp. But just in a nutshell, what this is doing is actually installing the source files of Tailwind into our project. And it's the recommended thing to do. Now, Tailwind does provide a play CDN. This essentially lets us import a simple script tag, just like we did in Bootstrap, and allows us to use Tailwind straight away. You can see here, the documentation says, the Play CDN is designed for development purposes only and is not the best choice for production. Development purposes just means for the purpose of building this locally on our device, whereas production is a live web application. So in a real project that's live on the internet, the Play CDN is not what you want to be using. You do want to install it properly with Node Package Manager. But besides the 2 different methods, the use of Tailwind we're going to be using in this project is the exact same as if you were using the npm install method here. So the only difference between these 2 is just how you install it. Once it's installed, it's the same Tailwind you're going to be working with. Okay, so let's go start a new project and get Tailwind installed into our project using the Play CDN. So I'm inside VS Code. I've created an empty folder on my desktop called Future Full Stack, which I'm just going to drag into the project now. I'm going to remove this welcome page. I'm just going to go add a new file and call it index.html. Like always, I'm just going to go grab the boilerplate. Let's update the title to Future Full Stack. And let's go install the Play CDN. All we do is copy this line of code and add it inside our head tag. I'm going to place it just above the title. All right, so I'll save. And just to get started, I'm going to add an H1 with the title Hello World. Let's go check this out in the browser. All right, we can see Hello World there. I'm going to zoom in quite a bit. and you'll see straight away that this hello world is looking different to what it would look like with the default browser styling. Just to show you this, I'm going to comment out this script tag. I'll refresh, and here we are back to the default browser styling. Okay, let's add this back in. I'll refresh, and you can see Tailwind has been successfully installed. You can see there's kind of been a CSS reset applied, where margin and padding has been stripped away, and our font style has changed. Now we're going to come and remove this soon, but just so we can start getting comfortable with the use of Tailwind utility classes, let's go add some simple ones to this heading. Back inside the documentation, let's go change the font size. All I do is simply search font size in the search bar, click the result, and you can see here a systemized table of all the different font sizes. For example, the utility class TextLG has a font size of 1.125 rem, or 18 pixels, and a line height of 1.75 rem, or 28 pixels. Let's go add this Text3XL, which is a font size of 30 pixels. All I do is in the H1, I add a class and paste that utility. Let's go bold the text. I'll search font weight. Here the different utility classes are, with their corresponding properties. Let's give it a font bold, which is a font weight of 700. In the class, I just simply add that. So let's check these out in the browser. Our font size is now much larger and is bold. So you can see how Tailwind's utility classes makes it so easy to style different HTML elements. Alright, so looking back at our completed project, the first thing I want to go do is add our main page container. If I open up DevTools and click the device toggle icon, you can see we have this container, which is setting a maximum width for large screen sizes. And as I reduce the width of the browser, the main page container is keeping the content away from the edge of the screen. Okay, so in Tailwind, I'm going to search container. This is under layout. Now you can see there's just one container class. And on the right here, it shows you what's happening at different breakpoints. So for example, at the small breakpoint, that is at 640 pixels, the max width is set at 640 pixels, which means that for our container, the width is set at 640 pixels until we hit the next breakpoint at 768 pixels. So for example, at 700 pixels, which is between these two values, our container is going to have a width of 640 pixels. You can see that anything less than 640 pixels will just stretch the full width of the screen, because the width is set at 100 pixels. Now there's some important documentation on how to use the container. I want to highlight this sentence here. Note that unlike containers you might have used in other frameworks, Tailwind's container does not center itself automatically, and does not have any built-in horizontal padding. And it explains here how to center the container by using this MX auto utility. M stands for margin, X is for the X direction, that is left and right, and auto is the auto value. We're going to be looking at all the different margin properties a bit later, but hopefully this one is fairly intuitive. It's setting an X direction margin to auto, which is something we always need to do when writing our own CSS for a container. Now, as I mentioned earlier, for less than 640 pixels has a width of 100%. Now for my containers, I always like to have a little bit of extra space left and right. So the documentation says we just need to go and add a small padding value. And we'll see how to do this in a second. So first up, I'm just going to copy the container utility class and the MX auto utility class. Inside our project, I'm going to create a new div. I'll add class and paste in those utilities. And I'm just going to put my H1 inside our main container. All right, back on the page, I'll refresh. And you can see our hello world has moved in slightly. If I open up DevTools, you'll see that when I select the H1, the blue box is no longer going right up to the left and right edge. And this shows how our container has been activated. Now, as I mentioned earlier, for smaller screens, less than 640 pixels, the container is going to stretch to the full width of the page. So you can see here at 553 pixels, our H1 is going right up to the edge of the page. Now to fix this, I'm just going to go add some small padding value left and right, just like the documentation suggests we do. So I'm going to go search, padding, I'll click this. Now for padding, there's a whole long list of different sizes. Now the way these are structured is that there's different characters followed by a hyphen and then a number. So let's look at some common padding utilities we're going to be using. Just the value P represents padding on all four sides. The value 0 representing 0 pixels. P followed by X is padding in the X direction, that is padding left and padding right. 0 representing the value left and right. PY is in the Y direction, so padding top, padding bottom. we have padding top, padding right, padding bottom, and padding left. And you can see this pattern is repeated for different values. So for example, P3 represents padding in all directions of 0.75 rem, which is 12 pixels. And we have the same thing for the other padding utilities. For example, PY3 is padding in the Y direction, top and bottom, of the same value, 0.75 rem. And if I scroll down, you'll see we're provided with a long list of values to avoid us ever having to write our own custom CSS. So for example, we go up to the value P96, which is 24 rem or 384 pixels. So this long list of values should cover us for most cases. And just to show you, margin works the exact same way. It's the same notation, but instead of a P, we have an M, where the second character, like X and Y, represent left and right and top and bottom, and the numerical value is the exact same, where, for example, 3 is 0.75 rem or 12 pixels. Okay, let's jump back to padding. I want to go just add a small left and right value, so that's going to be px, and let's use px5. That is 1.25 rem left and right. So back inside our projects, I'm just going to paste that utility. Okay, let's check it out in the browser. I'll refresh, and you'll now see we have a small padding value, which looks great on small screens. Now this padding value is still being applied on larger screens. You can see it in green over here. Now we don't really need that, and we will be removing this padding for larger screen sizes when we look at responsive design. Alright, so let's start working on our main hero section. So the first thing I want to go do is define the height of the hero section, which is set at 100 view height units. So all of this content is above the fold. In Tailwind, I'm going to search height, and the first thing I want you to notice is that these same numerical values are being used for the height property. For example, H3 is 0.75 rem, which is the same value that was on padding and margin. And this is what I said earlier about Tailwind being very systemized. This numerical value 3 is used as 0.75 for different properties throughout Tailwind. I'm going to scroll down, and you can see this H screen value is the height of 100 view height units. So I'm going to grab this utility. Back inside our project, let's go add the HTML for our hero section. I'm going to remove this H1. I'm going to add the semantic header tag, and then going to add a section tag for our hero section. Let's add class here, and I'm going to add the utility HScreen. So this section is 100 view height units. Now, just so we can see it in the browser, let's go add some background color. In Tailwind, I'll search background color. And for now, it doesn't matter what color we use. I just want to be able to see our hero section. So I'll just choose BG Orange 500, and I'll paste that in our class. Okay, let's check this out in the browser. I'll refresh, and you can see we now have our orange background color. And we can see the 100 view height is working because as I increase and decrease the height of the browser, the hero section is stretching the same height. Okay, so let's now go set up the structure for this group text and image. To do that, I'm going to be using CSS Grid. This is a simple grid with 2 columns and 1 row. So to show you how grid works, I'm just going to go grab 2 divs, which will be our 2 grid items. So in the Tailwind documentation, let's now go use this left navigation bar. I'm going to scroll up to Flexbox and Grid, and I'm straight away going to go to Grid Template Columns. So here are all the utilities for setting different columns. Now we're going to use Grid Cols 2, which simply sets 2 grid columns, each with 1 fractional unit. If I scroll down, you'll see that to use this, we also need to use the Grid utility to activate Grid. So I'm just going to copy this. Back in our project, I'm going to come add Grid, and then I'm going to paste in Grid Cols 2. Now, just so we can see these 2 columns, I'm going to cut the BG Orange 500 color. I'm going to come and add it onto this column. I'm going to add another class, paste it, and just increment the value to 600, which will be another shade of orange. So what we should see now are 2 equal columns with slightly different orange background colors. Let's check it out in the browser. So I'll refresh, and you can see we now have our 2 columns, each set with 1 fractional unit, so they're each taking up 50% of the available width. Alright, so let's start adding in the content for our hero section. Now the hero section contains 2 images, the logo over here, and me standing with my laptop. So the first thing I want to do in our project is create a new folder called Images. Now I've made these available for you to download in the description, and I'm just going to drag them across into the Images folder. So here we have a PNG with me holding my laptop and the Future Full Stack logo. So in the left column, we have a logo, heading text, paragraph text, and 2 buttons, and on the right we have a single image. Now, just so you can follow along, all text content is available in a Google Doc in the description below. And I'm just going to be copying and pasting it from my clipboard. All right, for now, I'm just going to leave these background colors so we can better see our columns. Inside the first column, I'm going to grab the image tag and add the logo by going images/logo.svg. And I'll just give this the alt text logo. The next element I'm going to add is an H1, and I'm just going to copy in the content for the H1. The next element will be a paragraph, and I'm just going to paste in the content. We then had 2 buttons. I'm going to structure these inside an unordered list. It'll contain 2 list items for our buttons. I'll add an anchor tag. As I have no other pages, I'm just going to put the pound symbol as the href value. The text for the first button was get started. I'll copy this anchor tag, paste it in our second list item, and the text over here was learn more. All right, so that's our first column done. For our second column, I'm going to remove the div and just add our image, as that is the only grid item. For the source, I'll go to images, and this is Dan holding his laptop. For the alt text, I'm just going to put Dan holding laptop. Okay, the final thing I want to do is just remove this background color, as we no longer need it. So let's check this out. I'll refresh, and we now have all the content on the page inside our 2 grid columns. Now, our images are obviously way too big, and I also want you to notice our text is the same size and style. Our H1 is no different to our paragraph. So now we need to go resize our images and go apply some text utility classes, as well as make our anchor tag actually look like buttons. All right, so let's first go sort out the sizing of our images. Inside Tailwind, I'm going to search for width. And just like height, we have the same systemized notation, where instead of H, we have W followed by numerical values. For the logo, I want to set its width as 192 pixels, or 12 rem. So I'm just going to copy this utility. Inside the image, I'm going to add class and set W48. I'll refresh, and you can see our image is now a much more appropriate size. Let's go sort out the image of me holding my laptop, as right now it's way too big. Now with this image, I don't want to set a fixed size. I rather want it to be a proportion of the column it is in. So to do that, I want to be using a percentage width value. You can see here how it works. For example, if you want to set a width to 1/3 of a container, you would use W-1/3. Now I want my image to be 3/4 or 75%. I'm simply going to copy this utility here. On the image, I'm going to add a class and paste in that value. All right, let's check it out. So our image has now reduced to 75% the width of the grid column. Next up, let's go and align our grid items. On the left column, our text has been vertically centered, and in the right column, our image has been horizontally centered. So back inside the documentation, I'm going to scroll to Flexbox and Grid, and we know that to center grid items inside grid cells, along the row axis, we're using Justify Items, and along the column axis, we're using Align Items. So let's go to Justify Items. So for Justify Items, we want to center our content along the row axis. So I'll grab Justify Items Center. In our HTML file, I'm going to come and add that onto our main section container, where we're defining our grid. Back in our page, I'll refresh and watch how the image is going to shift to the middle of this column. So you'll see the image is now horizontally centered. Now, because Justify Items was applied to the entire grid, the div containing all of this content has also been centered, but it has no effect because the div is a block level element expanding the full width of the column. Just to show you this in DevTools, if I come and select this div, you'll see that its width in blue is the full width of the grid column. So Justify Item Center is being applied here to center the div, but because the div is the same width as the column, there's no space to move, so nothing happens. Whereas the image, you can see its width is smaller than the width of this column. That is, this grid item has a smaller width than this grid cell. So there is space for this grid item, the image, to center horizontally inside the grid cell. All right, let's go center vertically using the Align Items property. To set Align Item Center, we're going to use the utility class Item Center. I'll copy that and add it onto our grid container. All right, I'll refresh and watch how both our image and div containing all this content vertically centers on the page. Okay, great, this is looking a lot better. Now applying Align Item Center did center both the container, because you can see its vertical height is a lot smaller than the height of the column, and the image, because the image height is also less than the height of the column. That is, both these grid items have a height that is less than their respective grid cells. All right, so next up, let's go handle applying different font styles to our heading and paragraph. So it ends up looking like this. Now, the way I want to do this is I first want to go set up our base font style. I'm going to come and add this as a class onto the body tag. This is a fairly common approach where we come and apply a base font style, which will be applied by default to all text elements through inheritance on the body tag. And then for headings, we go and customize those individually. So back in the docs, let's first go handle the font size. I'll search font size, and I want our base font size to be 18 pixels. That is 1.125 rem. So I'll copy this class. I'll come on the body tag, add class, and paste in that utility. Next up, let's go handle the font weight. I want our base font size to have a font weight of 400, which is just normal weight. So I'll copy this and add it to our class. The final text property I want to add is the color. I'll search color. Under typography, we have text color. And for our base color, I want to use this value of text slate 600. Now, Tailwind provides some really nice base gray colors. There's slate, gray, zinc, neutral, and stone. So you have a whole variety to choose from. I'll copy text slate 600 and I'll add it into our project. All right, so let's check this out so far. I'll refresh and you'll see all our text, including the heading, paragraph, and anchor tags, have had those text styles applied because I've added it as a global style to the body tag and it's all been inherited. So our paragraph is done through the base font style, but let's go now sort out our heading. I'll first go back to font size. For our H1, I want our text to be quite large, at 60 pixels. So I'll copy text 6XL. On our H1, I'm going to add a class and paste in that font size. Let's go change the font weight. I want our headings to be bold with a weight of 700. So I'll copy this and add it onto our class. For the color, I want to use a darker shade of our base text slate 600 color. So I'm going to choose 800. I'll copy this and add it onto our class. Now the last thing I want to do is tighten up the letter spacing. I'll search letter spacing, and I want to have a small negative value, like minus 0.25 rem. So I'll copy this class, tracking tight, and I'll add it onto our H1. All right, let's check this out on our page. I'll refresh, and you can see this heading is looking great. All right, next up, let's go style these buttons. We want them to look like this, where the buttons are placed next to each other horizontally. So let's go first implement the layout and get them next to each other using Flexbox. Inside the documentation, I'm going to scroll up to Flex Direction. Now for us, our buttons are going to be in a row, which is just the default value, so we don't actually need to use a class like Flex Row. But here you can see all 4 Flex Direction values. Now you can see with Flexbox, just like Grid, we need to use the Flex Utility class to activate it. So on the left menu here, you can see Gap. And just like margin, padding, width, and height, we're back to the same systemized approach, where different characters and values represent different directions and space units. Now for Flexbox, I just want to come and add a small gap value of 1.5 rem, which is 24 pixels. You can see gap 6 is the one to use, whereas gap X and gaps Y are specifically used inside Grid. So I'll copy this utility. All right, so in our project, I want our unordered list to be our Flex container, and our 2 list items are the Flex items. So let's go and add a class. I'll add Flex to make this a Flex container, and I'll paste in gap 6. I'll refresh, and you can see our anchor tags are now next to each other, with a small gap value between them. And I didn't need to set a Flex direction, because by default, our main axis is in row going from left to right. All right, let's now go style these 2 buttons. The first thing I want to do is add a blue background color to this primary button. Inside the documentation, I'll search background color. I'm going to scroll down to the blue color, and I'm going to select BG Sky 500. On our anchor tag, I'm going to come and add a class and paste in that utility. While I'm here, I also want to set the hover state. Inside the documentation, I'm going to scroll up to core concepts where it says hover focus and other states. You can see this is really easy to do. All we do is put the word hover with a colon and then the color we want it to be. So back inside the project, I'm just going to copy this. I'm going to add the word hover, add a colon, paste in that style, and just change it to a darker shade of 700. Okay, the next thing I want to do is make the text color white. So I'll search color, text color, and you can see over here, text white sets a white color. So I'll copy that and add it onto this class. Okay, let's check this out so far. I'll refresh, and you can see the button is starting to take form. You'll see when I hover over it, the color also changes. So to finish this off, let's go and add some padding around it and round the corners. So I'll search padding. Now the rule of thumb for button padding is we want our width to be double the height. So I'm going to add padding left and right of 32 pixels or 2 rem, which is this px value here. I'll copy it and add it onto our class. Now half the height is going to be py4. I'll scroll up and you can see py4 has a padding top and bottom of 1 rem. So I'll copy this and paste it in our class. Now the final thing we need to do is add some border radius. So I'm going to come here and search border radius. I just want a small border radius of say 6 pixels. So I'm going to copy rounded MD for medium. So in our project, I'll just paste that class. All right, let's check this out. I'll refresh and you'll see our button is now complete. So let's talk about what's happening here, where this padding is kind of overlapping the content above. In the box model topic of the course, we spent some time discussing that when you apply box model properties like padding onto an inline element like this anchor tag, they just apply weirdly. And we sought to fix this, we converted our inline element into an inline block element. So in Tailwind, I'm going to search inline block. This is handled in the display property. And you can see here we have display inline block. So I'm going to copy this class. And just a note, in this display property, you can also see where we're grabbing flex from and where we're grabbing grid from. Okay, so on our anchor tag, I'm just going to come and add inline block. On our page, I'll refresh and you'll see that fixes the issue. All right, let's now go and style our secondary button here. So I'm going to come and add a class. For the background color, I'm going to use the same slate as we use in our text, but I'm going to give it a lighter color of 400. We'll then do the hover state by setting hover : BG slate, and I'll give it a value of 500 for the hover state. I want the text to be white, so we'll use text white like we used above. And then I'm just going to copy the same padding values, rounded values, and also make it inline block. All right, that's the work done. I'll refresh, and we now have a good-looking secondary button with a hover state. All right, the last thing we need to do on the hero section is just create some vertical spacing between this content by adding in some margin. I'll search margin, and I'm going to use the margin bottom property on our different elements. You can see that's our class here, MB for margin bottom. Inside our left column, on the image, I'm going to go add some margin bottom 4. I'll copy this. I'm going to add the same margin bottom onto our heading. And then for our paragraph, I'm going to add margin bottom of 8, as I want to create more space between these elements and our buttons. Okay, I'll refresh and watch how our content spreads out horizontally. All right, nice. That's our hero section done. So moving across to the completed project, let's now go handle this how it works section. For this section, I'm actually going to be using one of Tailwind's components, so I can show you how that works and how we can go modify it to fit our exact design. In the Tailwind documentation, I'm going to head to Components. I'll click this link here. I'm going to scroll down, and in Page Sections, I'm going to go to Feature Sections. Tailwind gives us a few feature sections we can copy straight into our project, as well as some paid ones down here. For our project, I'm just going to be using this feature section here. If I click Code, you can see the underlying code that will be copied into our project. And I just click this clipboard icon over here. All right, heading back to our HTML file. I'm going to first set up the HTML structure by grabbing the main tag, and then I'm going to grab a section tag for the hero section. I'll then paste in the page section sitting in my clipboard. Okay, so just zooming out a bit, you can see all this code is using Tailwind utility classes to style the how it works section. Let's go check it out in the browser. I'll refresh, and you can see down here, we have the how it works section. We have the feature section from Tailwind's components. So now what we're going to do is modify some of the styles so it better matches the styles in our project. For example, the primary color used here is this purple color, and we want to change that to our primary blue color. Okay, let's work top down and start modifying this component. The first thing I want to do is actually just get rid of this small heading. That isn't really in line with our style, and on the final project, we don't have it. So in the HTML file, I'm going to come here and just remove this H2, which says deploy faster. I'll refresh and you'll see it's disappeared. Now, because that was a heading tag, the component puts this as a paragraph. That no longer makes sense in our markup, so I just want to go convert this to an H2. So you can see here the paragraph. Let's just go convert this to an H2. Okay, I'll refresh and there's no change, but this is now a better markup. So let's now take care of the styles on this heading. We'll go through these utilities one by one. MT2 is margin top 2, which I'm going to leave. We then have this text pretty style. So let's go see what that is. I'll head back to the Tailwind documentation and I'll just search text pretty. So you can see here under text wrap, text pretty sets text wrap to pretty. So what is this pretty value? I'm going to scroll down and you can see it says use text pretty to prevent orphans, which is a single word on its own line at the end of a text block. So this is quite a cool property. You can see this heading, Beloved Manhattan Soup Stand closes. The word stand could fit over here, but to make this text more pretty, the word stand is being pushed onto the second line. And this just looks a lot nicer than having a single word on a line by itself. So I'm going to leave this utility as it is. Now text 4XL, to work out if that's appropriate, let's go compare this to our H1. Over there, we're using text 6XL. So this is actually fine, because we want our H1 to be bigger than our H2, so text 4XL is appropriate. Now the font weight is being set by font semi-bold. I do want to update this to the same font weight we use in our H1, as I like my font weights for headings to be consistent. So I'll copy this utility here, and I'll replace it with font bold. Tracking tight, we also used on our H1, which just reduces the letter spacing. Text gray 900 is the text color, which we do want to update to our text color we set on our H1 of text slate 800. So I'll copy that, I'll remove this and paste it there. Now these two classes here, SM with a colon, text 5XL, and LG with a colon, text balance, has to do with responsive design, so that this heading is responsive. Responsive design is something we're going to be looking at towards the end of this project. And just a note, we're going to have to go make some different elements in here responsive as well. But to make things a bit simpler, for now I just want to ignore it. So in this markup, anytime you see something with a colon after it, like LG colon or SM colon, just ignore it for now. We will be looking at a great length a bit later, but just know for now, this is to ensure our elements are responsive. So let's check out what we've done so far in the browser. I'll refresh, and you can see now this H2 is looking much more like our H1 here. Next up, let's go handle this paragraph. MT6 is margin top 6, which I'll just leave for now. Now in our project, we're setting the base text properties on our body class so that elements like the paragraph will just inherit these. So I'm actually just going to go remove these styles over here. Checking back in our project, this paragraph is now the same style as this paragraph here. So next up, let's go handle the content inside this grid. All right, so back inside our HTML file, let's go identify the different features. I'm going to zoom out a bit. And you can see over here, we have this div with the opening tag here and the closing tag here. And this unit contains the content for each feature and is repeated for each feature. Now, before we start playing around with this, there are some HTML elements here which aren't that commonly used. You can see we have this DL tag, which wraps all 4 features. This DT tag, which wraps the icon SVG and the title of the feature. And then this DD tag, which is kind of like the paragraph text. So what are these tags? So let's quickly check them out on MDN docs. The DL tag is the description list element. The documentation says the DL HTML element represents a description list. The element encloses a list of groups of terms specified by using the DT element and description provided by the DD element. So you can see in this sample markup here, we have a main DL wrapper tag, which is the definition list. You can think of this as like an unordered list tag. And instead of list items, we have repeating groups of DT and DD tags, where DT is a definition term, which in our final design might be more like a heading, and a DD tag, which is a definition description, which in a final page is more like a paragraph. So that's what those tags are. In all honesty, you could just replace your DL, DTs, and DDs with divs. But the reason Tailwind isn't doing that is they want to provide a bit more semantic meaning to this section, because you can see there already are a lot of divs being used for different layout goals. So don't let these more uncommon tags throw you off. Tailwind are just using them for a better semantic approach. So once again, we can see this DT tag contains the icon and the heading text, and this DD tag contains what is like the paragraph text. We will update the actual content of that icon, but for now, let's just go change the color. The color is actually being defined on this div here, where it has BG Indigo 600. Let's go update that to our primary color of Sky 500. I'll copy this utility there. I'll remove this and paste it there. So that will change the color, and the actual icon we're going to go update soon. for this text push to deploy, it's being controlled by the utilities in here. So I'm going to remove this and replace it with text LG. On our H2, we're using 4XL. And for this heading, I want to use a bit of a smaller text size. In the Tailwind documentation, if I search font size, text LG is 1.125 rem, or 18 pixels. Next up, I want to replace font semi-bold with font bold, and then update the text color to the heading text color of Text Slate 800. So I'll copy that, remove this, and paste this there. All right, let's go handle the DD tag. Because this is still a text element, it is going to inherit the base text properties we set on our body tag. So all I'm going to do here is I'm going to keep margin top 2 and just remove these two properties here. And the base properties will be inherited. So let's check this out in the browser. I'll refresh, and you can see how this now compares to the others, where the colors and styles are a lot more in line with what we did in the hero section. All right, let's now just go copy this for the other 3 features. I'm going to zoom out a bit. And I'm just going to copy this entire div and replace it with each of the divs over here. So I'll remove that, paste this there. For the next div, I'll remove that, paste it again. And for the 4th one, I'll remove that and paste it here. Let's jump back to the browser and make sure this worked. I'll refresh, and you can now see all our styles have been applied. So now let's just update the text content. So we have here how it works, and this text content over here. In our markup, this H2 now needs to become how it works. And this paragraph text, I'm just going to replace with what I have sitting in my clipboard. Okay, I'll refresh, and you can see this is now updated. For the feature section, I'm just going to copy what I have in my clipboard. The heading over here is high quality. And the DD, which is like the paragraph text, I'm just going to copy from my clipboard. All right, I'll refresh, and you can see this content has now changed. Now, just to avoid boring you, I am just going to go update the other 3 in the same way. Okay, so in the markup, I've gone ahead and updated all of that. On the page, I'll refresh, and you can see all our content is now updated. All right, so the final thing we need to do for this section is just go update our icons. Now, unfortunately, Tailwind doesn't provide an out-of-the-box solution for icons, so we need to go use another tool. One of my favorite tools is Ion Icons, and we're going to see how easy it is to import them into our project. If I click Usage, all we need to do is copy these 2 script tags and place them near the end of the page right before your closing body tag. So I'm going to scroll down to the bottom of our page, and just before our closing body tag, I'm going to paste these 2 script tags. So this now gives us access to Ion Icons, and let's go now add them into our project. I'm going to click Icons, and for this first icon, I have this play button. So I'm going to search play. It's this one over here. When I click it, you'll see I get this web component code, and all I need to do is copy it and paste it in our project. The current icon is an SVG, which I'm just going to comment out for now. I'm going to paste in our special Ion icon, and let's refresh to see what we get. I'll refresh, and you can see the icon is imported, but the size and color are a bit wrong. Our other icons are a bit larger and are white. So all we do is comment out a class onto this. You can see the original SVG had a size of 6, so I'm just going to copy that inside our class, and the text color was white. So I'm just going to copy that and paste it here. Okay, I'll refresh, and you can see now our icon is much more in line with the original style, and this is looking great. Back in the HTML, I'm just going to go remove this SVG. Now, you also could have downloaded this icon as an SVG and done it that way, but the whole beauty of Ion Icon is it gives you this simple web component that's very concise, and it's very easy just to pop on some Tailwind utility classes. Okay, the other icons I have are a magnifying glass, this list, and this piece of paper. So if I search here, search, there's the magnifying glass, list, there's the list, and paper, there's the folded paper. And just to avoid boring you, I'm going to import them into the project and update the styles the exact same way. All right, so I've gone ahead and replaced all the SVGs with our Ion icons, like the magnifying glass for detailed, and added in the same class I applied on the first one we did. So I'll refresh, and our icons are now successfully imported. All right, so that's the How It Works section complete. So far we've done our hero section, and our How It Works section, and our page is starting to look great. All right, so next up, let's go handle the CTA card down here. Back in our HTML file, I'm first going to go set up the HTML structure for this. I'll grab a section tag. Inside the section tag, I'm going to add a single div, which will be a container for the CTA card. I'll add an H2, which has the text, "It's time to boost your career." I'll then add a paragraph, which has the text, "Your new future is one click away." And then I'll just add an anchor tag with the text, "Get started." And I'm just going to put a pound symbol here for now. So first up, let's go handle the different font styling. For the H2, I'm just going to copy the utilities in our H2 in the How It Works section. I don't need margin top. I'm going to copy all of these and just ignore these responsive utilities, and we'll add those in a bit later. So I'll come down here, add a class, and paste in those properties. For the paragraph, I'm actually not going to add any styles because these are all going to be inherited by the body tag. So let's check this out so far. I'll refresh, and you can see down here, the content is starting to appear. We have our H2 and paragraph, which has styling consistent with the rest of the page. Let's now go handle the Get Started button. You can see the background color of the button is white, and the text is blue, which is the opposite of the primary button. For now, I'm just going to copy the styles on our primary button over here. I'll paste it here, and I will come and update this soon once we apply blue background color onto the card. So I'll refresh, and you can see our blue button is down here. Let's go define this blue card. On our div, I'm going to add a class. I'm going to add our primary background color, which is BG Sky 500. I then want to add some width to this card. In the documentation, I'm going to search max width. I'm going to scroll down, and I'm going to set a maximum width of 48 rem, or 768 pixels. So I'll copy that utility class, and I'll paste it over here. I want the corners to be rounded, so I'm going to use rounded-MD, which is the same rounding on our buttons over here. I'm then going to add some padding all the way around the card. I'll use the padding, and I'm going to set a value of 12. P12 corresponds to 3 rems or 48 pixels of padding all around the card. Okay, so let's check out our work so far. I'll refresh, and you can see the card is starting to come together. Let's go fix up some of the styling now, as we want all our text to be white and the button to be white. So what I'm going to do is set text white onto the div over here, so the white color is inherited by our different text properties. I'm also going to come and remove text slate 800 here, as we no longer need that. For the button, I want the background color to now be white, and I want the text color to be Sky 500. I'm just going to leave the hover background color as Sky 700. All right, so let's check this out. I'll refresh. Okay, this is looking good. I've just noticed a small mistake where this text color should be blue. And that's being caused by not removing this text white property over here. So I'll remove that. So now the color will be blue. All right, this is looking great. Now, before we come and center the entire card, I just want to center these text elements inside the card. So to easily do that, on our div, I'm just going to come and add the utility text center, which will center both our block elements, our H2 and paragraph, and our inline element, the anchor tag. Ordinarily, when you apply text center onto an anchor tag, it doesn't work, but when you apply text center onto a parent container, it will center both block and inline elements inside the container. So I'll refresh, and you'll see this is all nicely centered. Okay, so the final thing we need to do is now center this entire card into the middle of the page. To achieve that, I'm going to use Flexbox. I want to center this entire div. So I'm going to add a class. I'll activate Flexbox by using the utility Flex. This now makes the entire section a Flex container, and this single div a Flex item. So by default, our main axis is running from left to right in row. And we know that to shift our Flex item along the main axis, we need to use the Justify Content property. Let's head to the documentation. So I'll search Justify Content, and we want to center it. So Justify Content Center, where Justify Center is the utility we want to use. So I'll copy that and paste it over here. Okay, let's jump back to the page and refresh. And you can see now our card is nicely centered. Now the last thing I want to do is just add a bit of margin between the heading and paragraph and button. On the H2, I'm just going to add a margin bottom value of 4, and I'll use the same value on our paragraph. Okay, I'll refresh, and now there's just a bit more extra space in our card. Okay, the last thing I want to do is just create quite a bit of white space between our CTA section and where our footer will be. On the section, I'm just going to add a margin bottom of 64, which is 15 rems or 240 pixels. I'll refresh, and we now have some white space between our CTA card and the bottom of the page. Okay, the final thing we need to take care of is just this very simple footer down the bottom. In our HTML, I'm going to grab the footer semantic element. I'm just going to paste in the content from my clipboard, and I'm simply going to add the class text center to center this text on the page. I'll refresh, and there we have our very simple footer. Alright, so this page is now finished for desktop. We have our hero section, our how it works section, our CTA card, and simple footer. Alright, so we're up to the final stage of the project, where we're going to make our page responsive. So let's go check out our page at different screen sizes to identify some issues. I'm going to open up DevTools. I'm going to click on the toggle device icon over here. And let's start with the hero section. I'm going to reduce the width of the browser, and you can see this is starting to look really bad. For smaller screen sizes like this, we want our image to pop below. You can also see the font size is just way too big. And because of this layout issue, it's causing issues on the How It Works section below, where this is now appearing on top of it. Now the How It Works section is actually looking really good. This is because this page section is already built as a responsive design. So there's not much we need to do here. We will take a look at the code to see how this is working. Scrolling down to the bottom of the page, the CTA section, we want to look at reducing some of the padding, as this is just getting a bit too busy. And I'll also want to reduce the margin between the CTA and the footer, because for screen sizes like this, it's just too big. So let's go check out how responsive design works in Tailwind. I'm going to head to the documentation. On this left navigation bar, under core concepts, I'm going to go to responsive design. Looking at this sentence here, every utility class in Tailwind can be applied conditionally at different breakpoints, which makes it a piece of cake to build complex responsive interfaces without ever leaving your HTML. So this is really cool. Every single utility class can become responsive. So responsive design in Tailwind takes the exact same approach as responsive design in Bootstrap. Tailwind has different breakpoints. You can see them in this table here. And just like Bootstrap, Tailwind takes a mobile-first approach. You can see this sentence, by default, Tailwind uses a mobile-first breakpoint system similar to what you might be used to in other frameworks like Bootstrap. So as a quick recap, we always want to start with the property that we want for mobile, which is just applied by default. So for example, let's say on mobile, we want our margin bottom to be 2, so MB2. We would apply MB2 by default, and then say on a large screen, that is when we hit 1024 pixels, we want our margin bottom to increase to 5. So we would write LG:MB5. And what that's saying is that when we hit 1024 pixels, increase the margin bottom to 5. And that will then just apply for everything above 1024 pixels, and everything below 1024 pixels will just be the default margin bottom we applied. So let's now go use these breakpoints in our design. Okay, the first thing I want to do is change our base text to be smaller on smaller screens. I want the default case to be text-MD, so medium text by default. And then when we hit medium screens, I want the text to go large. So once again, on smaller screens, our text is going to be medium. But then when we hit the medium breakpoint, which is 768 pixels, our text is then going to change to large. Let's check this out in the browser. I'll refresh. Now watch what happens to this paragraph text when I go past 768 pixels. So it is subtle, but it has changed font size. All right, the next thing I want to go sort out is that on our main container, the content is butting up right against the left here. For smaller screens, we're just going to go add a little bit of horizontal padding. So here's our container. Taking a mobile-first approach, I'm going to go add some padding in the X direction of 5. When I then hit medium screens, I want the padding to change to 0. So once again, this is reading as, by default, apply a padding of 5, but then when we hit the medium breakpoint, which is 768 pixels, change the padding to 0. That is, remove the padding. So let's check this out in the browser. I'll refresh, and you can see now we have some padding left and right. If I select the div, you can see in green, and go to the box model, you can see the padding of 20 pixels applied left and right. And then when I increase the browser, you can see the padding disappears. Okay, next up, let's go sort out our grid so that the image appears below the grouped text. For our hero section, the grid columns are being set by gridcols2. I only want our page to have 2 columns at the medium breakpoint. So I'm going to put MD:gridcols2, which means that by default, for screen sizes less than 768 pixels, because we're not defining any grid cols, it means our grid items are just going to be stacked in a single column. So let's check this out. I'll refresh, and this is looking way better. Our image is now appearing below our text. All right, so next up, let's go sort out this issue here. The reason this is happening is because we've set 100 view heights onto our hero section, and this content is just seeing the 100 view heights. So from the How It Works section point of view, it thinks I need to start at 100 view heights, which is actually now overlapping the hero section content. On our hero section, we have this HScreen utility, which is setting the 100 view heights, but I only want that to come on medium screens. So I'm going to add MD HScreen. So what this means is that by default, we don't have 100 view height set, but when we hit the medium breakpoint, 100 view heights is being set. So let's check this out. I'll refresh. So on this screen size, our hero section does not have 100 view heights. So the how it works section just appears below. And then when we go above 768 pixels, the hero section now does have 100 view height units. All right, the last thing I want to do on the hero section is just reduce the font size of our H1 on smaller screen sizes. Our H1 currently has a text size of 6XL. I want this only to start at medium screens, so I'm going to add MD. And then by default, I want our H1 to be 4XL. Let's check this out. I'll refresh. You can see the heading looks a lot better now. And when I increase the width of the browser, it goes back to 6XL. Now, one thing I've just noticed that I'd also like to correct is that on our main container, I'd like to add a little bit of vertical padding as well, so that the future full stack logo is not butting up right against the edge here. So I'm actually just going to remove the X, so that's padding in all directions for smaller screen sizes. And then on medium and above, I'm just going to remove the X so that we remove all the padding. I'll save, let's refresh. And now you can see we have some vertical padding as well. And that padding will disappear above the medium breakpoint. Okay, our hero section is looking good. Now, as I mentioned, the how it works section already comes fully responsive. So let's go check this out in the code. So I'm in the how it works section, and I'm not going to go line by line and show you every single responsive query, as I just don't want to bore you. But let's go identify a few to see how they're working. On this div here, we have text center being applied for large screens and above. This text center is being inherited by our H2 and paragraph. So what this means is that on smaller screen sizes, our text is going to be aligned left by default, and then on larger screens and above, it's going to be centered. Let's check this out. You can see the heading and paragraph are aligned left, and when I increase the width of the browser to a large screen size and above, the heading and paragraph become centered. You can see our H2 over here, by default, is text 4XL, and then when we hit the small breakpoint, it changes to 5XL. Over here, we also have this text balance utility being applied on larger screens and above. Now in the docs, let's check out what text balance is. You can see here, use text balance to distribute the text evenly across each line. You can see in this example here, if you didn't apply text balance, on the first line, this would likely read, beloved Manhattan soup stand, and then the word closes would just be on its own line, looking a bit unbalanced. So text balance nicely distributes the text content onto two lines when the text wraps. Now in our design, this isn't really relevant because our text isn't that long. But if it was longer, I'm just going to copy and paste this a few times. Let's see how this works. I'll refresh. And you can see that how it works is being applied nicely across two lines for larger screen sizes. When I reduce the width of the browser, it just goes back to the default behavior. Okay, I'm just going to change that back. Now there are quite a few instances of responsive design being applied, like over here, down here, and in a few other places. Now, from what I've taught already, you should be able to understand what each of these are doing, so feel free to go check them all out yourself. But the main thing here is that a Tailwind section comes responsive out of the box. All right, the last thing we need to take care of now is the bottom part of our page. All I want to do here is remove some padding on smaller screen sizes and just reduce the amount of margin between our CTA and our footer. So back in our code, I'm on the CTA section. At the moment, we're applying padding 12 all the way around. Let's go apply that only on medium screen sizes and above. And by default, let's just apply padding 4. So let's check this out. I'll refresh. And you can see this just looks a bit tighter. And on medium screen sizes and above, the padding increases. Now, just to show you an example of how you could apply 3 different breakpoints, we could have padding 4 as our default case. And then for the small breakpoint, I'm going to add a padding value of 8. So the way we read this is as follows. By default, we have padding 4. When we then hit the small breakpoint, which is 640 pixels, our padding changes to 8. And then when we hit the medium breakpoint, our padding changes to 12. So in other words, from 0 to 640 pixels, our padding is 4. From 640 pixels to 768 pixels, our padding is 8. And then from 768 pixels and above, our padding is 12. So here's an example of how you can apply multiple breakpoints to your single property. So let's check this out. So on this screen size, our padding will be 12. I'm now going to go to a value between 640 pixels and 768 pixels. So over here, our padding will be 8. And then above 768 pixels, our padding changes to 12. All right, the last thing I want to do is just go sort out this margin. On our CTA section, we're currently applying a margin bottom of 64. Let's go apply a margin bottom of 8 by default. And then for medium screens, we'll change it to 64. Let's check this out. I'll refresh. And you can see on smaller screens, this is a lot tighter. And when I increase, the margin significantly increases. Okay, nice work. This is the project done. You now have an incredibly solid foundation in Tailwind CSS. Congratulations, you've made it to the end and now have a solid foundation in CSS needed to work on professional projects. The next step is to learn JavaScript, which is responsible for adding interactivity and dynamic behavior to web pages, transforming static HTML and CSS into engaging and responsive user experiences. You can join my full JavaScript course for free on YouTube, where you'll experience the same high-quality teaching. Also make sure to subscribe to the channel to stay in the loop with new releases. And if you're serious about learning full-stack web development and interested in joining my bootcamp, make sure to check out futurefullstack.com. See you in the next video.